I worked at a logging camp near Port McNeill for 3 seasons, and by the 3rd year, I knew the routine like the back of my hand. The camp sat about 40 kilometers up a mountain logging road, accessible only by 4-wheel drive and only during the dry months. We'd run operations from April through September, cutting Douglas fir and western red cedar on Crown land leases, then shut everything down when the fall rains turned the roads into rivers of mud. The shutdown was always the same: tarps over the equipment, chains on the gates, a final walkthrough to make sure nothing was left running. Then we'd caravan back down to Port McNeill and spend the winter months doing maintenance work in town, waiting for the roads to dry out enough to head back up in spring. October 2017, I realized I'd left my good chainsaw and a set of specialized felling wedges in my locker at the camp. I'd need them for a small contract job I'd picked up in town, and buying replacements would cost more than I wanted to spend. The roads had been closed for 3 weeks, but we'd had a dry spell, no rain, for almost 10 days, and I figured if I took my truck and drove carefully, I could make it up and back in an afternoon. I didn't tell anyone I was going, didn't see the point. It was just a quick trip to grab my gear. I left Port McNeill around noon on a Tuesday, taking the main highway north before turning onto the logging road that led up into the mountains. The first 20 kilometers were fine. The road was rough but passable, just washboard and potholes. But as I climbed higher, the damage from the fall rains became more obvious. Sections of road had washed out completely, leaving gaps I had to navigate carefully. Culverts were clogged with debris. In a few spots, small streams had jumped their banks and carved new channels across the roadbed. I was starting to think this had been a bad idea, but I was already committed. Turning around would be harder than pushing forward. I reached the camp around 2:30. The gate was chained and locked, just like it should have been. I had a key, all the senior crew did, so I unlocked it, drove through, and locked it behind me. Basic protocol. The camp spread out ahead of me, and at first glance, everything looked normal. Equipment parked in neat rows under tarps, bunkhouses with their shutters closed, the mess hall dark and quiet, exactly what I expected to see. Then I noticed the generators were running. I could hear them before I even got out of the truck, that distinctive diesel rumble coming from the equipment shed. We had 3 big generators that powered the camp, and they should have been shut down and drained for the winter. But all 3 were running, their exhaust creating small clouds in the cool October air. I sat in my truck for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone else had come up for the same reason I had forgot something, needed to grab gear. But whose truck? I was the only vehicle here. And why would they start all 3 generators just to get into a locker? I got out and walked toward the mess hall. That's when I saw the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. Not a lot, just a thin gray stream rising into the overcast sky, but enough to tell me the wood stove was lit. The door to the mess hall was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and the warmth hit me immediately. The wood stove was burning hot, the way it always did during mealtimes. The overhead lights were on fluorescent tubes humming softly, and the tables were set for dinner. Plates at every seat, utensils laid out properly, coffee mugs turned upside down on saucers the way our cook always arranged them. The big commercial percolator on the counter was burbling, steam rising from its spout. I walked over and touched it, hot, fresh coffee. But the mess hall was empty. No cook in the kitchen, no crew sitting at the tables, no sound except the hum of the lights and the pop of wood burning in the stove. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" My voice echoed off the walls and died. No response. Just silence and the ambient sounds of a building that was occupied but empty. I walked through the kitchen, checking the prep areas, the walk-in cooler, the storage rooms. Everything was clean and organized, the way it always was between meals. But there was a pot of stew simmering on the industrial stove. I could smell it, see the steam rising. I lifted the lid. Beef stew, still cooking, the meat and vegetables tender like it had been going for hours. My heart was starting to beat faster now. This wasn't right. This was impossible. The camp had been shut down for 3 weeks. No one should be here. No one should have started the generators, lit the stove, made coffee, set the tables. But someone had, or something had. I left the mess hall and walked through the camp, checking each building. The bunkhouses were all locked, but I had keys for those too. Inside, they looked lived in. Bunks made, but not perfectly the way men make them, functional but sloppy. Gear hanging on hooks, work boots lined up by the doors. In Bunkhouse B, I found wet rain gear hanging to dry, water still dripping from the coats onto the wooden floor, fresh mud on the floors, a smell of sweat and diesel and wet clothes. In the foreman's office, I found the logbook open on the desk, the last entry dated that morning, Tuesday, the 17th of October 2017. Someone had written the day's assignments in the familiar handwriting of our foreman, Pete. North Block, sections 12 to 14, 3 faller teams, 2 skidder operators, 1 loader. Below that, someone had written the crew names. I recognized all of them. These were the guys I'd worked with all season, but that was impossible. The season had ended 3 weeks ago. Everyone had gone back to town. I'd been to the bar with half these guys just last weekend. I picked up the phone on the desk. Dead, no dial tone. The phone lines were always disconnected during shutdown to avoid paying for service we didn't need. I checked the equipment shed next. The generators were running normally, their fuel tanks half full. The maintenance logs showed they'd been serviced 2 days ago. Someone had written in careful block letters, "Oil changed, filters replaced, coolant topped off." That was Danny's handwriting. I recognized it immediately. Danny had been our lead mechanic. He'd also been dead for 2 years. He died in September 2015, killed by a widowmaker, a dead branch that had broken off during a fall and struck him in the head. It happened fast. 1 second he was standing there watching a tree come down. The next he was on the ground with his skull crushed. We'd shut down operations for 3 days for the funeral. Danny's wife had been there, his 2 kids. The whole crew had attended. But that was his handwriting in the logbook. I was certain of it. I stood in the equipment shed, staring at those maintenance logs, and felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The rational part of my brain was trying to find explanations. Someone was playing a prank. Someone else had handwriting similar to Danny's. The date on the foreman's log was wrong. Maybe Pete had been up here recently and filled it out by accident. But none of those explanations felt right. I walked back outside and stood in the center of the camp, listening. That's when I heard the chainsaws. Distant but clear, the high-pitched whine of saws cutting through wood, coming from somewhere up in the cut block. And beneath that, the deeper rumble of heavy equipment, a skidder moving logs, a loader working. The camp was operational. Somewhere up on that mountain, a crew was working. I got back in my truck and started driving up the main haul road toward the cut blocks, following the sounds. The road climbed for about 3 kilometers, winding through clear cuts from previous seasons, paths/piles, and temporary bridges. As I got higher, the sounds got louder. Chainsaws, definitely. Multiple saws. The way it sounds when several faller teams are working the same area. The crash and creak of trees coming down. The beep 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 of equipment backing up. I came around a bend and saw fresh activity. A cut block that had been marked but not logged when we shut down. Now it was being actively worked. Trees were falling. I could see them going down, the tops shaking and then disappearing below the ridgeline. Logs were being skidded to the landing. A loader was stacking them, but I couldn't see any people. Not the fallers, not the equipment operators. Just the work itself, happening as if invisible hands were operating everything. I stopped the truck and got out, standing there on the haul road, watching trees fall with no one to fell them, watching logs move with no visible skidder pulling them. The loader was stacking timber in neat piles, its hydraulic arm moving with practiced precision, but the cab was empty. I could see that from where I stood, no one at the controls. That's when I heard my name. "Richardson, hey Richardson," a voice calling from the tree line, maybe 50 meters away. Male voice, familiar, slightly annoyed. "Get over here, man. Saw's jammed. I need a hand." I knew that voice. Danny's voice. I looked toward the trees where the voice had come from. I could see movement in the shadows, a figure in logging gear, waving me over. But I couldn't make out his face. The light was wrong, the shadows too deep. "Richardson, come on, don't just stand there." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get back in my truck, drive down that mountain, and never come back. But there was another part of me, the part that had worked with these men for 3 years, that had trusted them with my life on dangerous cut blocks, that wanted to help, that recognized Danny's voice and wanted to respond. I took 3 steps toward the tree line. The figure waved again, more urgently. "That's it, come on. Just need you to hold this guide bar while I clear the chain." I took another step. Then I stopped, because I remembered. I remembered standing in the rain at Danny's funeral, watching his casket being lowered into the ground. I remembered his wife crying. I remembered his kids, 8 and 6 years old, holding hands and trying not to cry. I remembered the wake afterward, drinking too much whiskey and telling Danny stories with the other guys from the crew. Danny was dead. He'd been dead for 2 years. Whatever was calling my name from the tree line, it wasn't Danny. I backed up slowly, never taking my eyes off that figure in the shadows. It stopped waving, just stood there, motionless, watching me retreat. When I reached my truck, I got in, started the engine, and drove back down to the main camp. I didn't stop. I didn't grab my tools from the locker. I just drove through the camp, past the mess hall with its smoke still rising from the chimney, past the bunkhouses with their dripping rain gear, past the equipment shed with its running generators. I drove back down the mountain faster than I should have, taking corners too quick, not caring about the damage to the road. I just needed to be away from there, away from whatever was running that camp. When I got back to Port McNeil, I went straight to the company office. The camp supervisor was still there, finishing paperwork before heading home. I told him everything. The running generators, the set tables, the fresh coffee, the maintenance logs in Danny's handwriting, the sounds of work being done by a crew I couldn't see, and I told him about the voice calling my name from the tree line. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he just nodded, like I'd told him something he already knew. "The old crew," he said quietly. "They never really left." I stared at him. "What?" "That camp's been running since the 70s, he said. "Different companies, different crews, but the same camp. And some of the men who worked there, some of them never clocked out. They're still up there, still working, still logging those cut blocks. We shut down every winter because the roads are too dangerous, but the camp keeps running. It always has." "That's insane," I said. He shrugged. "Maybe, but you saw it, you heard it, and you're not the first. Every few years, someone needs to go back up during shutdown, and every time, they find the same thing. Generators running, coffee hot, crew working. Some guys try to join them. Those are the ones we never see again." I thought about that figure in the trees, waving me over, asking me to help with a jam saw. If I'd walked into those trees, would I have come back out? "Danny called to you?" the supervisor asked. I nodded. "Danny was a good mechanic, good man, but he's been gone 2 years. What called to you up there? That wasn't Danny. That was something else wearing his voice." I quit the next day, transferred to a different operation down in the Fraser Valley, working smaller cut blocks closer to civilization. I've been logging for 15 more years since then, but I've never gone back to that camp near Port McNeil. But sometimes, when I'm working a remote site and the light starts to fade, I hear it. Distant chainsaws, the rumble of heavy equipment, the sounds of a crew working just beyond the tree line. And I hear voices calling my name, asking me to help with a jam saw or give them a hand moving a log. I don't respond. I don't walk toward those voices, because I know what they are now. I know what's calling. Some logging camps never really shut down, some crews never stop working, and some men never leave the mountain. I just hope I'm not one of them. I've worked logging camps across British Columbia for almost 15 years, and you get to know the geography of these places pretty quick. The mess hall is always central, bunkhouses arranged around it in some kind of pattern, equipment sheds on the perimeter, and everything else fills in the gaps. At the camp near Quesnel, where I worked the summer of 2019, we had 3 bunkhouses, A, B, and C. Simple layout. Bunkhouse A was closest to the mess hall, housed the senior crew and the foreman. Bunkhouse B was for the equipment operators and mechanics. Bunkhouse C, where I stayed, was for the fallers and the general labor crew. 40 men total, spread across 3 buildings, with a few extra bunks in each for when we brought in contract workers during peak season. I'd been at that camp for 2 months when I first saw Bunkhouse D. It was a Tuesday night in mid-July, hot and muggy, even at that elevation. The kind of heat that makes sleeping difficult, where you wake up every hour drenched in sweat and have to flip your pillow to find a cool spot. I woke around 2 in the morning needing to use the bathroom. The facilities were in a separate building between the bunkhouses, so I pulled on my boots and headed out into the night. The camp was quiet. Most of the crew was asleep, and the generators had been turned down to minimal power, just enough to keep the coolers running and maintain the security lights. I walked across the gravel yard between Bunkhouse C and the bathroom facility, And that's when I saw the lights. There was a fourth building, set back from the others, partially obscured by a stand of pine trees I'd never paid much attention to. But there it was, a bunkhouse, same construction as the others, with lights glowing in the windows. Warm yellow light, like kerosene lamps rather than the harsh fluorescent tubes we had in A, B, and C. I stood there in the gravel yard, staring at it, my bladder temporarily forgotten. Above the door, barely visible in the dim light, was a hand-painted sign, Bunkhouse D. My first thought was that I'd somehow gotten turned around, confused about the layout of the camp. But I'd been living here for 2 months. I knew where everything was, and that building hadn't been there yesterday. I was certain of it. I walked toward it slowly, my boots crunching on gravel, then going silent as I stepped onto the grass and moss that surrounded it. The building looked old, older than the other bunkhouses. The wood siding was weathered gray, and the windows had that wavy quality of antique glass. But the lights inside were steady, and I could see shadows moving against the curtains. I got within maybe 20 feet before I stopped. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous exactly, but off. Like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. I stood there for maybe a minute, just watching, trying to decide if I should knock on the door or go find the foreman. Then the lights went out, all at once, like someone had blown out a lamp. The building went dark, and in the sudden absence of light, it seemed to recede into the shadows. I blinked, trying to adjust my eyes, and when I looked again, I wasn't sure I could see the building at all anymore, just trees and darkness. I went to the bathroom, went back to my bunk, and lay awake until dawn, trying to convince myself I'd been half asleep and confused. The next morning at breakfast, I asked the guy sitting next to me, a equipment operator named Rick, who'd been at the camp for 3 seasons, if there was a 4th bunkhouse. He looked at me like I'd asked if there was a swimming pool. 3 bunkhouses, man, A, B, and C. You feeling okay? I told him what I'd seen. He just laughed and said I'd probably been dreaming. That happens sometimes when you wake up to piss in the middle of the night. Your brain's still half in sleep mode, making things up. But I knew what I'd seen. So after breakfast, I walked over to where Bunkhouse D should have been. Rick and 2 other guys came with me, more out of curiosity than belief. There was nothing there, just forest. Pine trees growing close together, undergrowth thick with ferns and salal. No building, no foundation, no sign that anything had ever been built in that spot. The ground was undisturbed, covered in decades of fallen needles and organic debris. Rick patted me on the shoulder. See, no bunkhouse, you were dreaming. I wanted to argue, but what could I say? The building was gone. Maybe he was right, maybe I had been dreaming. I tried to forget about it. Went back to work, cutting timber on the north slope, falling trees and bucking them into logs, loading trucks. The days were long and hot, and by the time I got back to camp each evening, I was too exhausted to think about much except food and sleep. 3 nights later, I saw it again. I woke around midnight, this time not needing the bathroom, but just unable to sleep in the heat. I got up and went outside to cool off, thinking I'd sit on the steps of Bunkhouse C and smoke a cigarette. That's when I saw the lights. Bunkhouse D was back. Same location, same weathered wood, same warm yellow light in the windows. But this time I could see it more clearly. It wasn't fading in and out or disappearing. It looked solid, real. I stood there smoking, watching it, trying to understand what I was seeing. Part of me wanted to wake up Rick and the others, drag them out here and prove I wasn't crazy. But another part of me, the part that had been logging in remote camps long enough to know that some things don't have easy explanations, told me this was something I needed to deal with alone. I finished my cigarette, ground it out under my boot, and walked toward Bunkhouse D. The building grew more solid as I approached, details resolving that I hadn't noticed before. The door was painted dark green, the paint peeling. The windows had curtains, faded floral patterns that looked decades old. There was a small porch, 2 wooden steps leading up to it. I climbed the steps. The wood creaked under my weight, but it felt solid, real. I reached for the door handle, half expecting my hand to pass through it like smoke. But the metal was cool and solid under my palm. The door was unlocked. I opened it and stepped inside. The interior was laid out like the other bunkhouses, 2 rows of bunks along the walls, a wood stove in the center, lockers at the foot of each bed. But everything was old, not just old vintage. The bunks were metal frame jobs from the 70s or earlier. The lockers were wood instead of the modern metal ones we had in the other buildings. And the gear hanging on the walls was from another era. Canvas jackets instead of Gore-Tex, leatherwork boots with the old-style laces, wool pants instead of synthetic fabrics. The light came from kerosene lamps mounted on the walls, their wicks turned low, casting that warm yellow glow I'd seen from outside. The air smelled like old wood smoke and canvas, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Not decay, but age, like opening a trunk that had been closed for decades. And there were men sleeping in the bunks. I could see them in the dim light, maybe a dozen of them. They were lying perfectly still under wool blankets, their faces turned toward the walls or covered with their arms. None of them moved when I came in. None of them reacted to the door opening or my boots on the wooden floor. "Hello?" My voice came out quieter than I'd intended, almost a whisper. No response. The men kept sleeping, their forms motionless under the blankets. I walked slowly down the center aisle between the bunks, looking at each sleeper as I passed. They were dressed in work clothes, flannel shirts, wool pants, suspenders, the kind of gear loggers wore 40 or 50 years ago. Their boots sat at the foot of each bunk, laced and ready. I stopped beside the nearest bunk. The man lying there was on his side, facing away from me. I could see his hair, dark and greasy, curling over the collar of his flannel shirt. One arm was draped over the side of the bunk, hanging loose. "Hey," I said, a little louder now. "You okay?" Still no response, not even a twitch. I reached out and touched his shoulder, intending to shake him awake. My hand went through him, not like touching a ghost in a movie, where your hand passes through with some kind of resistance or cold sensation. This was different. My hand simply moved through the space where his shoulder should have been, encountering nothing. No resistance, no temperature change, nothing. It was like he wasn't there at all, or like I wasn't there, like one of us was out of phase with reality. I jerked my hand back, my heart suddenly hammering. The figure in the bunk hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, just kept lying there, perfectly still, perfectly silent. I backed away slowly, my eyes moving from bunk to bunk. All the men were the same, motionless, sleeping but not sleeping, present but not present. I turned and walked quickly back to the door, trying not to run, trying to keep my breathing steady. When I reached the threshold, I looked back one more time. The bunkhouse was exactly as I'd found it, dim light, sleeping men, the smell of old canvas and wood smoke. Nothing had changed. Nothing had acknowledged my presence. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. The night air hit me like a slap, cool and real and solid. I stood on the porch for a moment, my hands shaking, trying to process what I'd just experienced. Then I walked back to Bunkhouse C, climbed into my bunk, and lay there until sunrise with my eyes wide open. I didn't tell anyone what I'd seen. What would I say? That I'd walked into a building that didn't exist and met men who weren't really there? They'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But I kept watching that spot in the trees, kept waiting to see if the lights would appear again. They did. 4 more times over the next month, always at night. Always the same warm yellow glow from the windows. I never went inside again. I just watched from a distance, trying to understand what I was seeing. And I started to notice something. Each time Bunkhouse D appeared, there was one more empty bunk than there had been before. The first time I went inside, I'd counted the sleeping men. 12 of them, with maybe 6 or 8 empty bunks scattered throughout the building. The second time I saw the lights, I didn't go inside, but I looked through the window. There were only 11 men, one more empty bunk. The third time, 10 men. The fourth time, 9. The men were disappearing, or leaving, or being taken somewhere. One by one, the bunks were emptying. I asked around camp, trying to be casual about it, whether anyone knew the history of the site. Rick told me the camp had been operating since the late 60s, different companies but the same location. Good timber, good access to the highway. It made sense to keep using it. I asked if anyone had ever died at the camp. Rick shrugged and said probably logging's dangerous work, people die. But he didn't know specifics. Said I should ask the foreman if I really wanted to know. I didn't ask the foreman. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The 5th time I saw Bunkhouse D, there were only 8 men left, and one of the empty bunks had my jacket hanging on it. Not a jacket like mine, my exact jacket. The one I'd left hanging in Bunkhouse C, the same stain on the left sleeve, where I'd gotten pitch on it last week. The same torn pocket. I stared at that jacket through the window for a long time, my breath fogging the glass. The 8 remaining men slept on, oblivious or uncaring, and that empty bunk waited, freshly made with wool blankets, boots at the foot, my jacket hanging ready. I left the camp 2 days later, told the foreman I had a family emergency, needed to head back to the coast. He was annoyed we were in the middle of a big push, trying to finish a cut block before the weather turned, but he let me go. I haven't been back to that camp, haven't worked the Quesnel area since. I took a job down in the Fraser Valley, working smaller operations closer to civilization. But I think about those men sometimes, the ones sleeping in Bunkhouse D, lying still under wool blankets in a building that appears and disappears. I think about how their numbers were decreasing, one by one, empty bunks accumulating like a countdown. And I think about my jacket, hanging in that phantom bunkhouse, waiting on an empty bunk that had my name on it in ways I couldn't see but could feel. I wonder how many other men have seen Bunkhouse D, how many walked inside and never walked out. How many are lying in those bunks right now, sleeping but not sleeping, present but not present, waiting for whatever comes next. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed at that camp long enough to see all the bunks fill up again. If the countdown had started over, if my bunk in Bunkhouse C had been found empty one morning, my gear still there, my boots by the bed, but me gone. Gone to Bunkhouse D, where the men sleep forever under wool blankets in warm yellow light, one by one disappearing into whatever darkness waits at the end of that countdown. I'm glad I didn't stay to find out. But sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if I really left it all. If maybe I'm still there, lying in that empty bunk, my jacket hanging ready, sleeping but not sleeping, while the world goes on without me. And I wonder if someday I'll wake up and find myself in Bunkhouse D, with 11 other men who made the same mistake I did, all of us waiting for the countdown to reach 0. We were clearing a cut block about 30 kilometers east of Mackenzie in late August, when we found the tree that wouldn't fall. I'd been working that contract for 6 weeks with my partner Tommy, both of us experienced fallers with a decade each in the bush. We knew how to read timber, knew how to make the cuts, knew the physics of bringing down a tree safely. After 10 years, falling becomes almost automatic. You size up the tree, plan your escape route, make your cuts in the right sequence, and gravity does the rest. It's dangerous work, but it's predictable if you know what you're doing. This tree wasn't predictable. We'd been working our way through a stand of old second-growth Douglas fir, trees that had been left during previous logging operations 20 or 30 years back. Good timber, straight grain, minimal rot. The kind of trees you want to fall because they're valuable and relatively easy to work with. Most of them were between 80 and 120 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet in diameter. Standard stuff. But this one was different. This one was massive, maybe 150 feet tall, 4 feet across at the base. Old growth. The kind of tree that should have been logged decades ago, when the original forest came down, but somehow it had been missed. Or left. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by the younger second-growth timber, like a grandfather tree that had watched generations of forest grow and fall around it. Tommy and I stood looking up at it, trying to figure out why it was still there. Sometimes loggers will leave a particularly impressive tree as a landmark or out of some kind of respect. But this one was right in the middle of our cut block, marked with spray paint like all the others. No reason not to take it down. "That's a big bastard," Tommy said, running his hand along the bark. "Gonna be a nice one to fall, though. Straight, no lean, good wood." I nodded, walking around the base, checking for rot or instability. Everything looked solid. The tree was healthy, bark intact, no signs of disease or insect damage. Just a big, beautiful Douglas fir that had somehow survived when everything around it had been logged. We set up our gear, cleared the escape routes, and Tommy started the undercut. The chainsaw bit into the wood cleanly, throwing chips of fresh-smelling fir. He made the face cut at about a 45-degree angle, cutting about a third of the way through the trunk, then made the horizontal cut to meet it. The wedge of wood fell away clean. Perfect cut. Then he moved to the back side and started the back cut, the saw screaming as it chewed through the wood. He cut until he was within a couple inches of the face cut, leaving just enough hinge wood to control the direction of the fall. Standard procedure. The tree should have started to lean, to creak, to show signs it was ready to go, but it didn't. Tommy finished the back cut, and stepped back, killing the saw. We both stood there, waiting for the tree to fall. You always wait a few seconds, sometimes there's a delay as the wood fibers start to separate and the weight shifts. But this delay went on longer than it should have. 5 seconds, 10, 20. The tree just stood there. "That's weird," Tommy said. He walked around to check the cuts. They were clean, meeting properly, with no hinge wood left. By all rights, that tree should have been on the ground. "Wind must be holding it," I said, though there was barely any breeze. "Let's wedge it." We got our falling wedges, thick plastic wedges that you hammer into the back cut to help push the tree over. Tommy placed 2 of them in the kerf and started pounding them in with a sledgehammer. The wedges went in deep, forcing the back cut wider, applying pressure. I could hear the wood starting to complain, those creaking sounds that mean a tree is about to go. But it still didn't fall. It just stood there, cuts clean through, wedges driven deep, defying everything we knew about physics and timber falling. "What the hell?" Tommy muttered. He hammered the wedges in deeper, putting his whole body into it. The creaking got louder, but the tree didn't budge, didn't lean, didn't show any signs of movement. We tried cables next, ran a cable high up the trunk, attached it to a skidder, and had the operator pull. The cable went taut, humming with tension, and the skidder's tires dug into the ground as it strained. Still nothing. The tree stood firm, like it was bolted to the earth. By this point, the foreman had come over to see what was taking so long. He was a guy named Bill, 40 years in the bush, seen everything. He walked around the tree, checked our cuts, watched us pull with the cable, and just shook his head. "Never seen anything like this," he said. "Cuts are good. No reason it shouldn't be on the ground." "So what do we do?" Tommy asked. Bill thought for a moment, looking up at the tree. "Leave it for today. I'll bring in a bigger skidder tomorrow, maybe a yarder if we need it. Something's weird here, and I don't want anyone getting hurt trying to force it." We left the tree standing there, cuts complete, wedges still in place, and moved to other timber. But I kept looking back at it throughout the day. There was something unsettling about it, a tree that should have fallen but refused to. Like it had decided it wasn't ready to come down, and no amount of force was going to change its mind. That night at camp, 3 guys from our crew didn't show up for breakfast. Mark, Dave, and Sean, all experienced loggers, guys who'd been working the site as long as we had. They weren't in their bunks, weren't in the mess hall, weren't anywhere we could find them. Bill organized a search party. We split into groups and combed the cut block, calling their names, checking the equipment sheds, and the recently cleared areas. It was Tommy who found them. They were at the base of that tree, the one that wouldn't fall. All 3 of them were sitting in a circle around the trunk, their backs against the bark, staring up at the canopy, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Their eyes were open, tracking slowly across the branches high above, but they didn't seem to see us. Didn't respond when we called their names. Didn't react when we walked right up to them and waved our hands in front of their faces. "Mark!" Tommy shouted, shaking his shoulder. "Mark, what the hell are you doing out here?" Nothing. Mark just kept staring up at the tree, his mouth slightly open, his breathing slow and regular, like he was in some kind of trance. We tried with the other 2. Same result. They were physically present but mentally gone, locked into whatever they were seeing or hearing in that tree. Bill made the call to carry them back to camp. It took 6 of us, 2 per person, to lift them and haul them out of the cut block. They didn't resist, but they didn't help either. Just hung limp in our arms, still staring up at the sky even as we carried them away from the tree. We got them back to camp and laid them out in the mess hall. Bill called for a medic, but the nearest medical facility was an hour away. We sat with them, trying to get them to snap out of it, checking their vitals. Their hearts were beating normally. They were breathing fine, but they wouldn't respond, wouldn't blink, just stared at the ceiling with that same distant, focused expression. It was maybe 3 hours later when they finally came back. Mark first, blinking suddenly like he was waking up from a deep sleep. Then Dave and Sean, within minutes of each other. They looked around confused, disoriented, not understanding why they were in the mess hall with the whole crew standing around them. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "You tell us," Bill said. "We found you at the base of that big fir, sitting there like statues. You've been out of it for hours." Mark looked at the other 2. They both had the same confused expression, like they were trying to remember something that kept slipping away. "I don't," Mark started, then stopped. His face went pale. I heard something. In the tree. A voice. No, not a voice. More like singing or humming. I can't describe it. I heard it too, Dave said quietly. It was calling us. We went to listen. What was it saying? Bill asked. I don't remember, Mark said. He looked genuinely distressed, like he was trying to grab hold of a memory that was dissolving as he reached for it. Just that it wanted us to listen, that it had something to show us, something important. Sean hadn't spoken yet. He was staring at his hands, turning them over slowly, like he didn't quite recognize them. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. It's old, he said. So old. Older than the forest. Older than the mountains. It's been there since before. He stopped, shook his head. I can't explain it, but we shouldn't cut it down. We can't. Bill let them rest for the remainder of the day, then called a meeting that evening. He told us the big fir was off limits. Nobody goes near it. Nobody tries to fall it. Nobody even walks through that part of the cut block. He said he was bringing in a specialist, someone who understood weird timber situations, though I'd never heard of such a thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that tree, standing there with clean cuts through its trunk, refusing to fall. Kept thinking about Mark, Dave, and Sean sitting at its base, lost in some kind of trance. Something about it felt deeply wrong, like we'd stumbled onto something we weren't meant to find. The next morning, Bill got us up early, said we needed to go check on the tree before the specialist arrived. I didn't want to go back there, but orders were orders. We walked into the cut block as the sun was coming up, casting long shadows through the remaining timber. When we reached the clearing where the big fir had been standing, we all stopped. The tree was gone. Not fallen, not cut down, gone. Where that 150-foot Douglas fir had been standing where we'd made our cuts, driven our wedges, run our cables, there was nothing but empty ground. No stump, no sawdust, no drag marks or signs that anyone had hauled it away. The soil was undisturbed, covered in a light layer of duff and moss, like nothing had ever grown there. Tommy walked to where the tree should have been, knelt down, and ran his hand over the ground. This doesn't make any sense. A tree that size, the root system goes down 20, 30 feet. There should be something, anything. But there was nothing, just earth. Then Bill called out. He was standing a few feet away, looking at something on the ground. We gathered around and saw what he was staring at. Someone had scratched words into the dirt, deep scratches, like they'd used a stick or their fingers to carve through the topsoil. The letters were rough but unmistakable. Not yours to take. We stood there reading those words over and over, and nobody said anything for a long time. The forest around us was completely silent. No birds, no wind, no sound except our own breathing. Finally, Bill spoke. Pack up your gear. We're leaving this cut block. I'll tell the company we hit unstable ground, geological issues, whatever. But we're done here. Nobody argued. We walked back to camp, loaded our equipment, and were off the site by noon. The company wasn't happy about abandoning a productive cut block, but Bill stuck to his story. Said the ground was unsafe, liability concerns, all the corporate language that makes decisions final. I never went back to that area. Never worked near Mackenzie again if I could avoid it. And I never told anyone outside the crew what really happened. What would I say? That we found a tree that defied physics? That 3 men went into a trance at its base? That the tree vanished overnight and left a message in the dirt? But I think about it sometimes. Think about that old-growth Douglas fir standing alone in that cut block, watching generation after generation of forest fall around it. Think about what Mark said, that it was old, so old, older than the forest itself. And I think about those words scratched into the ground. Not yours to take, not ours to take. Maybe it never had been. Maybe some things in the forest aren't resources to be harvested. Maybe some things are meant to stand. No matter how many saws we bring, no matter how many cables we run, no matter how many men we send to cut them down. Maybe some things have been there longer than we can understand, and they'll be there long after we're gone. I hope we learn that lesson. I hope nobody else tries to fall that tree, wherever it is now, because I don't think it would end well for them. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through the trees outside my house, I swear I can hear it. That humming, that calling, the sound Mark and Dave and Sean heard, the sound that pulled them in and held them transfixed. I hear it, and I'm glad I never got close enough to really listen, because I don't think I would have come back. We were clearing a cut block about 30 kilometers east of Mackenzie in late August when we found the tree that wouldn't fall. I'd been working that contract for 6 weeks with my partner Tommy. Both of us experienced fallers with a decade each in the bush. We knew how to read timber, knew how to make the cuts, knew the physics of bringing down a tree safely. After 10 years, falling becomes almost automatic. You size up the tree, plan your escape route, make your cuts in the right sequence, and gravity does the rest. It's dangerous work, but it's predictable if you know what you're doing. This tree wasn't predictable. We'd been working our way through a stand of old second-growth Douglas fir, trees that had been left during previous logging operations 20 or 30 years back. Good timber, straight grain, minimal rot. The kind of trees you want to fall because they're valuable and relatively easy to work with. Most of them were between 80 and 120 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet in diameter, standard stuff. But this one was different. This one was massive, maybe 150 feet tall, 4 feet across at the base. Old growth, the kind of tree that should have been logged decades ago when the original forest came down, but somehow it had been missed or left. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by the younger second-growth timber, like a grandfather tree that had watched generations of forest grow and fall around it. Tommy and I stood looking up at it, trying to figure out why it was still there. Sometimes loggers will leave a particularly impressive tree as a landmark or out of some kind of respect. But this one was right in the middle of our cut block, marked with spray paint like all the others. No reason not to take it down. "That's a big bastard," Tommy said, running his hand along the bark. "Gonna be a nice one to fall, though. Straight, no lean, good wood." I nodded, walking around the base, checking for rot or instability. Everything looked solid. The tree was healthy, bark intact, no signs of disease or insect damage. Just a big, beautiful Douglas fir that had somehow survived when everything around it had been logged. We set up our gear, cleared the escape routes, and Tommy started the undercut. The chainsaw bit into the wood cleanly, throwing chips of fresh-smelling fir. He made the face cut at about a 45-degree angle, cutting about a third of the way through the trunk, then made the horizontal cut to meet it. The wedge of wood fell away clean. Perfect cut. Then he moved to the back side and started the back cut, the saw screaming as it chewed through the wood. He cut until he was within a couple inches of the face cut, leaving just enough hinge wood to control the direction of the fall. Standard procedure. The tree should have started to lean, to creak, to show signs it was ready to go. But it didn't. Tommy finished the back cut and stepped back, killing the saw. We both stood there, waiting for the tree to fall. You always wait a few seconds. Sometimes there's a delay as the wood fibers start to separate and the weight shifts. But this delay went on longer than it should have. 5 seconds, 10, 20. The tree just stood there. "That's weird," Tommy said. He walked around to check the cuts. They were clean, meeting properly, with no hinge wood left. By all rights, that tree should have been on the ground. "Wind must be holding it," I said, though there was barely any breeze. "Let's wedge it." We got our falling wedges, thick plastic wedges that you hammer into the back cut to help push the tree over. Tommy placed 2 of them in the kerf and started pounding them in with a sledgehammer. The wedges went in deep, forcing the back cut wider, applying pressure. I could hear the wood starting to complain, those creaking sounds that mean a tree is about to go. But it still didn't fall. It just stood there, cuts clean through, wedges driven deep, defying everything we knew about physics and timber falling. "What the hell?" Tommy muttered. He hammered the wedges in deeper, putting his whole body into it. The creaking got louder, but the tree didn't budge, didn't lean, didn't show any signs of movement. We tried cables next. Ran a cable high up the trunk, attached it to a skidder, and had the operator pull. The cable went taut, humming with tension, and the skidder's tires dug into the ground as it strained. Still nothing. The tree stood firm, like it was bolted to the earth. By this point, the foreman had come over to see what was taking so long. He was a guy named Bill, 40 years in the bush, seen everything. He walked around the tree, checked our cuts, watched us pull with the cable, and just shook his head. "Never seen anything like this," he said. "Cuts are good. No reason it shouldn't be on the ground." "So what do we do?" Tommy asked. Bill thought for a moment, looking up at the tree. "Leave it for today. I'll bring in a bigger skidder tomorrow, maybe a yarder if we need it. Something's weird here, and I don't want anyone getting hurt trying to force it." We left the tree standing there, cuts complete, wedges still in place, and moved to other timber. But I kept looking back at it throughout the day. There was something unsettling about it, a tree that should have fallen but refused to. Like it had decided it wasn't ready to come down, and no amount of force was going to change its mind. That night at camp, 3 guys from our crew didn't show up for breakfast. Mark, Dave, and Sean, all experienced loggers, guys who'd been working the site as long as we had. They weren't in their bunks, weren't in the mess hall, weren't anywhere we could find them. Bill organized a search party. We split into groups and combed the cut block, calling their names, checking the equipment sheds and the recently cleared areas. It was Tommy who found them. They were at the base of that tree, the one that wouldn't fall. All 3 of them were sitting in a circle around the trunk, their backs against the bark, staring up at the canopy, perfectly still, perfectly silent. Their eyes were open, tracking slowly across the branches high above, but they didn't seem to see us. Didn't respond when we called their names. Didn't react when we walked right up to them and waved our hands in front of their faces. "Mark," Tommy shouted, shaking his shoulder. "Mark, what the hell are you doing out here?" Nothing. Mark just kept staring up at the tree, his mouth slightly open, his breathing slow and regular, like he was in some kind of trance. We tried with the other 2, same result. They were physically present but mentally gone, locked into whatever they were seeing or hearing in that tree. Bill made the call to carry them back to camp. It took 6 of us, 2 per person, to lift them and haul them out of the cut block. They didn't resist, but they didn't help either. Just hung limp in our arms, still staring up at the sky even as we carried them away from the tree. We got them back to camp and laid them out in the mess hall. Bill called for a medic, but the nearest medical facility was an hour away. We sat with them, trying to get them to snap out of it, checking their vitals. Their hearts were beating normally. They were breathing fine, but they wouldn't respond, wouldn't blink, just stared at the ceiling with that same distant, focused expression. It was maybe 3 hours later when they finally came back. Mark first, blinking suddenly like he was waking up from a deep sleep. Then Dave and Sean, within minutes of each other. They looked around confused, disoriented, not understanding why they were in the mess hall with the whole crew standing around them. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "You tell us," Bill said. "We found you at the base of that big fir, sitting there like statues. You've been out of it for hours." Mark looked at the other 2. They both had the same confused expression, like they were trying to remember something that kept slipping away. "I don't," Mark started, then stopped. His face went pale. "I heard something. In the tree. A voice. No, not a voice. More like singing or humming. I can't describe it." "I heard it too," Dave said quietly. "It was calling us. We went to listen." "What was it saying?" Bill asked. "I don't remember," Mark said. He looked genuinely distressed, like he was trying to grab hold of a memory that was dissolving as he reached for it. Just that it wanted us to listen, that it had something to show us, something important. Sean hadn't spoken yet. He was staring at his hands, turning them over slowly like he didn't quite recognize them. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "It's old," he said. "So old. Older than the forest. Older than the mountains. It's been there since before." He stopped, shook his head. "I can't explain it, but we shouldn't cut it down. We can't." Bill let them rest for the remainder of the day, then called a meeting that evening. He told us the big fir was off limits. Nobody goes near it. Nobody tries to fall it. Nobody even walks through that part of the cut block. He said he was bringing in a specialist, someone who understood weird timber situations, though I'd never heard of such a thing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that tree, standing there with clean cuts through its trunk, refusing to fall. Kept thinking about Mark, Dave, and Sean sitting at its base, lost in some kind of trance. Something about it felt deeply wrong, like we'd stumbled onto something we weren't meant to find. The next morning, Bill got us up early, said we needed to go check on the tree before the specialist arrived. I didn't want to go back there, but orders were orders. We walked into the cut block as the sun was coming up, casting long shadows through the remaining timber. When we reached the clearing where the big fir had been standing, we all stopped. The tree was gone. Not fallen, not cut down, gone. Where that 150-foot Douglas fir had been standing, where we'd made our cuts, driven our wedges, run our cables, there was nothing but empty ground. No stump, no sawdust, no drag marks or signs that anyone had hauled it away. The soil was undisturbed, covered in a light layer of duff and moss like nothing had ever grown there. Tommy walked to where the tree should have been, knelt down, and ran his hand over the ground. This doesn't make any sense. A tree that size, the root system goes down 20, 30 feet. There should be something, anything, but there was nothing, just earth. Then Bill called out. He was standing a few feet away, looking at something on the ground. We gathered around and saw what he was staring at. Someone had scratched words into the dirt. Deep scratches, like they'd used a stick or their fingers to carve through the topsoil. The letters were rough but unmistakable. Not yours to take. We stood there reading those words over and over, and nobody said anything for a long time. The forest around us was completely silent. No birds, no wind, no sound except our own breathing. Finally, Bill spoke. "Pack up your gear. We're leaving this cut block. I'll tell the company we hit unstable ground, geological issues, whatever, but we're done here." Nobody argued. We walked back to camp, loaded our equipment, and were off the site by noon. The company wasn't happy about abandoning a productive cut block, but Bill stuck to his story. Said the ground was unsafe, liability concerns, all the corporate language that makes decisions final. I never went back to that area, never worked near Mackenzie again if I could avoid it. And I never told anyone outside the crew what really happened. What would I say? That we found a tree that defied physics, that 3 men went into a trance at its base, that the tree vanished overnight and left a message in the dirt. But I think about it sometimes. Think about that old-growth Douglas fir standing alone in that cut block, watching generation after generation of forest fall around it. Think about what Mark said, that it was old. So old. Older than the forest itself. And I think about those words scratched into the ground. Not yours to take. Not ours to take. Maybe it never had been. Maybe some things in the forest aren't resources to be harvested. Maybe some things are meant to stand, no matter how many saws we bring, no matter how many cables we run, no matter how many men we send to cut them down. Maybe some things have been there longer than we can understand, and they'll be there long after we're gone. I hope we learn that lesson. I hope nobody else tries to fall that tree, wherever it is now, because I don't think it would end well for them. And sometimes, late at night when the wind moves through the trees outside my house, I swear I can hear it. That humming, that calling, the sound Mark and Dave and Sean heard, the sound that pulled them in and held them transfixed. I hear it, and I'm glad I never got close enough to really listen, because I don't think I would have come back. Logging camps run on schedules that you could set your watch by. The day crew starts at 6 in the morning, works until 6 in the evening, comes back to camp for dinner, and hits the bunks by 9. Equipment operators have their designated machines. Fallers have their sections. Maintenance runs during lunch breaks and Sundays. After working these camps for 12 years, I knew the rhythm as well as I knew my own heartbeat. Everything at a logging camp is accounted for, every man, every machine, every hour of the day. That's why I noticed when things started happening outside the schedule. It was my second month at a camp about 20 kilometers west of Quesnel, working a spruce and pine contract for a mid-sized timber company. Good operation, decent crew, experienced foreman named Carl, who ran things tight and professional. We had 40 men on site, fallers, equipment operators, maintenance crew, cooks. Everyone had their role, everyone knew their shift. We didn't have a night crew, nobody worked after dark. That's standard for logging camps. The work is too dangerous to do without proper light, and running equipment at night is asking for accidents. So after dinner, the camp would quiet down. Men would play cards in the mess hall, watch movies in the bunkhouses, maybe have a beer or two before lights out. The cut blocks went silent. The machinery sat idle. The forest took back its darkness. Except I started seeing men walking toward the cut blocks at dusk. The first time I noticed was a Thursday evening in late September. I was standing outside Bunkhouse D, smoking a cigarette and watching the sun drop behind the western ridge. The light was that deep orange that comes right before true darkness, casting long shadows across the camp. That's when I saw them, 3 men walking past the mess hall, heading toward the main hall road that led to the active cut blocks. They were dressed in logging gear, canvas, work pants, flannel shirts, suspenders, cork boots, the kind of outfit you see in old photos from the 70s or 80s, before modern safety equipment and synthetic fabrics took over. But what caught my attention was that they were walking with purpose, like they were heading to work, at dusk. When the day shift had ended an hour ago, I figured they were maintenance crew, maybe going out to check equipment or secure something for the night. But we didn't have anyone scheduled for that. I knew the roster. Everyone was accounted for in camp. I watched them until they disappeared down the hall road, swallowed by the shadows between the trees. Then I finished my cigarette and went inside, pushing the sight to the back of my mind. Probably contractors I didn't know about. Probably something Carl had arranged without mentioning it to the whole crew. But I saw them again the next night. 4 of them this time, walking in a loose group, same old style gear, same purposeful stride toward the cut blocks. And then again on Saturday, 5 or 6 men, hard to count in the failing light. On Monday, I asked one of the other fallers, a guy named Pete who'd been at the camp since it opened, if there was a night maintenance crew I didn't know about. He gave me a strange look. No night crew. Why? I told him what I'd been seeing. Men walking toward the cut blocks at dusk, dressed in old logging gear. Pete's expression changed, went from curious to careful. You see them up close? See their faces? No, just from a distance. Why? He was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. Talk to Carl. He'll explain it better than me. That evening after dinner, I found Carl in the foreman's office, doing paperwork. I knocked on the door frame, and he waved me in without looking up. Got a minute? I asked. What's on your mind? I told him about the men I'd been seeing, the ones walking toward the cut blocks at dusk. He stopped writing mid-sentence, put his pen down carefully, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. You followed them? He asked. No, just saw them walking past. I figured they were... Don't follow them, Carl interrupted. His voice was quiet but firm. Don't go near the cut blocks after dark. Stay in camp. Stay in your bunkhouse. Mind your business. I don't understand. Who are they? They're not your concern. They don't bother us. We don't bother them. That's how it works here. He picked up his pen again, a clear dismissal. Stay in camp after dark. That's an order. I wanted to push, to ask more questions, but the way Carl was looking at me made it clear the conversation was over. I left the office feeling more confused than when I'd entered. That should have been the end of it. Carl had given me a direct order, and I should have followed it, but I couldn't let it go. The next evening, when I saw the shadow crew walking past 7 or 8 of them, this time I made a decision. I was going to follow them. I needed to know what was happening. I waited until they were about 50 yards ahead. Then I slipped out of camp and followed at a distance. The sun had set, but there was still enough twilight to see by. The shadow crew moved with the confidence of men who knew exactly where they were going, walking up the hall road without flashlights, without talking. Just the sound of their boots on gravel and the creak of their old canvas gear. I stayed back, using the trees for cover when the road straightened out. We walked for maybe 15 minutes, climbing gradually toward one of the active cut blocks. I knew this area. We'd been working it all week, falling trees and bucking them into logs, clearing sections that would be hauled out by the skidders tomorrow. The shadow crew turned off the hall road and walked directly into the cut block. I followed to the edge and stopped, watching from behind a pile of slash. The clearing was maybe 2 acres, covered in fresh stumps and stacked logs. Our equipment was parked at the far end, a skidder, a loader, a couple of pickups. Everything exactly where we'd left it at end of shift. The ground was torn up from the machinery, sawdust and wood chips scattered everywhere. A typical logged area, ready for the next phase of operations. The shadow crew gathered in the center of the clearing, standing in a loose group. Then, without any apparent signal, they spread out and started working. I heard the chainsaws first, that distinctive whine of a 2-stroke engine cutting through wood, echoing across the clearing. Then the crash and crack of trees falling, the shouts of fallers calling warnings, the rumble of equipment moving, all the sounds of an active logging operation. But there were no trees left to cut. We'd cleared this section already. The stumps proved it. I stood there confused, straining to see what they were doing in the growing darkness. The shadow crew was moving through the clearing, going through the motions of falling timber. I could see their shapes, men with chainsaws, men running cables, men directing the work. But when I looked at the actual trees they were cutting, there was nothing there. Or rather, there were only stumps. The trees were already down, already bucked into logs, already stacked and ready for transport. They were logging a forest that was already logged, going through the motions of work that had been completed hours ago. I watched for maybe 20 minutes, trying to understand what I was seeing. The sounds were real chainsaws, falling trees, diesel engines. But the work itself was impossible. They were cutting phantom timber, hauling phantom logs, operating in a space that no longer existed except in memory or history. Then one of them turned and looked directly at me. I was maybe 40 yards away, partially hidden behind the slash pile, but somehow he saw me, or sensed me, or knew I was there. He stopped what he was doing, whatever phantom work he'd been performing, and just stood there, staring in my direction. His face was wrong. Even at that distance, in the failing light, I could see it was wrong. Too pale, like old paper or bleached bone. Too smooth, like a mannequin's face. The features were there: eyes, nose, mouth, but they were empty, expressionless, like looking at a mask or a badly made doll. He raised his arm and pointed at me. Just pointed, his finger extended, his dead eyes locked on my position. And all the others stopped working and turned. 7 or 8 of them, all facing my direction now, all with those same empty faces. The sounds of work ceased immediately. The chainsaws went silent. The phantom crashes stopped. Just silence, and those figures standing in the darkness, pointing at me. I ran. I crashed through the slash pile and stumbled back toward the haul road, my boots slipping on sawdust and loose bark. Behind me, I could hear them moving, not running, but walking. Steady, purposeful footsteps crunching through the debris. Following me, I reached the haul road and ran down it as fast as I could in the near darkness, my lungs burning, my legs pumping. The sounds behind me kept pace, boots on gravel, multiple footsteps, never speeding up but never falling behind. Like they knew they didn't need to run, like they knew they could walk and still catch me. The camp lights appeared ahead, yellow and warm and real. I sprinted the last 100 yards and burst into the clearing between the bunkhouses, gasping for air. I looked back the way I'd come. The haul road was empty. The footsteps had stopped, but I could see them at the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the camp lights. Standing in a line, watching, those pale faces visible even in the darkness, all pointed toward me. I went straight to my bunkhouse and locked the door. Sat on my bunk with the lights on, my heart hammering, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat there, listening for footsteps outside, watching the door, half expecting those empty-faced men to come walking into camp. Carl found me the next morning. I was still in my bunkhouse, still dressed, still sitting on my bunk. He came in without knocking, took one look at me, and sighed. "You followed them," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. He pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. "I told you not to. I told you to mind your business and stay in camp after dark." "What are they?" I asked. My voice came out hoarse. Carl was quiet for a long moment, looking at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. "The Shadow Crew, that's what we call them. They've been working this camp for 40 years, give or take, since before I got here, and I've been running operations in this area for 20 years. But what are they? Ghosts. I don't know what they are. Nobody does. Best I can figure, they're men who worked here decades ago, men who died logging these mountains, and for whatever reason, they never stopped. They show up at dusk, and they work through the night, logging the same cut blocks over and over, going through the motions of the work they did when they were alive. Why didn't you tell me? Because most people never see them. You have to be looking at the right time, in the right place, and even if you see them, most people just ignore it, write it off as shadows or their imagination. The smart ones don't ask questions." He looked at me directly. "You're not one of the smart ones." "They saw me," I said. "They all stopped and looked at me. They followed me." Carl's expression darkened. "Yeah, that's a problem. Once they see you, really see you, acknowledge you, they remember. They'll watch for you now, look for you when they come through." "What does that mean?" "It means you need to be careful. Stay in camp after dark. Don't go near the cut blocks. Don't acknowledge them if you see them walking past. And whatever you do, don't follow them again." He stood up, moved toward the door. "Men who get too interested in the Shadow Crew, who try to talk to them or work with them, those men have a way of disappearing. We find their gear in the morning, sometimes their vehicles, but the men are gone, like they joined the Shadow Crew." "You think that's what happened? They joined them?" "I think they got pulled into whatever that is, that work that never ends, that logging operation that keeps running 40 years after the last tree fell." He paused at the door. "Don't let that happen to you. Stay away from them. They're not part of our world anymore, and we're not part of theirs. Keep it that way." Carl left, and I sat there processing what he told me. I wanted to think he was crazy, that this was all some kind of hazing ritual for new guys at the camp, but I'd seen those faces, those empty, mannequin faces, and I'd heard the sounds: real chainsaws, real falling trees, real work being done in a space where no work was possible. I stayed at that camp for another 3 weeks, long enough to finish the contract, and every evening at dusk, I watched from inside my bunkhouse as the shadow crew walked past. Sometimes it was 3 or 4 of them, sometimes it was a dozen. They never looked at the bunkhouses, never acknowledged the living camp, just walked with purpose toward the cut blocks, their old canvas gear creaking, their cork boots crunching on gravel. But once, just once, I saw one of them pause as he walked past my bunkhouse. He turned his head slightly, just enough to look at my window where I was standing. That same empty face, that same hollow stare. He didn't point this time, didn't stop walking. But he saw me, knew I was watching, and in that moment, I felt like he was deciding whether to come get me, whether to add me to their crew. Then he kept walking, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. I left that camp when the contract ended and never went back. Carl understood. He didn't try to talk me into staying, didn't ask if I'd be available for the next season. Just shook my hand and said, "Smart choice." But I still think about them sometimes. The shadow crew, working through the night in cut blocks that were cleared decades ago, falling trees that are already stumps, hauling logs that are already gone, going through the motions of work that never ends, trapped in some kind of loop that keeps them logging long after their bodies are buried. And I wonder how many of them chose it, how many saw the shadow crew one evening and decided to follow them, to see what they were doing. How many got too close and couldn't pull away? How many are walking those cut blocks right now, their faces gone pale and empty, their bodies moving through the motions of work they'll never finish? I hope none of them were like me, curious, stupid, unable to mind their own business. I hope they chose it somehow, that they wanted to keep working even after death. But I don't think they did. I think they got pulled in, one by one, year after year. And every time someone new sees them and follows them and gets too close, the shadow crew grows by one more man. I was lucky. I ran fast enough, stayed inside when Carl told me to, kept my distance. But sometimes late at night, I hear the sounds in my dreams: chainsaws whining, trees crashing down, the rumble of equipment moving through a forest that was logged decades ago. And I wake up wondering if one day I'll find myself walking at dusk toward a cut block I can't remember, dressed in old canvas gear, my face gone empty and pale, walking toward work that will never end. I started working at the logging camp near Vanderhoof in March 2018, hired on as a faller for a 6-month contract that would take us through the spring and summer cutting season. The camp was one of the older operations in the area, been running since the early 80s under different companies but always in the same location. Good access to crown land, solid timber, close enough to the highway to make hauling economical. About 40 men worked there during peak season: fallers, equipment operators, mechanics, road crew, and the support staff that kept the camp running. The foreman was a guy named Pete Whitmore, maybe 55 years old, been in the logging business his whole adult life. He ran a tight operation from a small office building at the center of camp, coordinating everything through a big CB radio setup that connected to all the equipment operators and crew leaders. Every piece of heavy equipment had a radio, every crew leader carried a handheld, and everything got logged through Pete's station. It was how you ran a safe operation: constant communication, everyone knowing where everyone else was, problems reported immediately. I'd been at the camp maybe 3 weeks when Pete mentioned the overnight transmissions. We were having coffee in the mess hall after dinner, and Pete looked tired in a way that went beyond a long day's work. He had that exhausted, stressed expression of someone who hasn't been sleeping well. "You ever hear the radio at night?" he asked me. I shook my head. "I'm in Bunkhouse C. Can't hear the office from there." "Right." He stared into his coffee for a moment. "It's probably nothing. Just some kind of interference, atmospheric conditions or something." I didn't push him on it. Pete wasn't the kind of guy who talked about problems unless they were affecting operations. And if he said it was probably nothing, that meant he'd already decided not to worry about it. But 2 weeks later, he brought it up again. It was late evening, and I'd gone to the office to file some paperwork about a damaged saw that needed replacing. Pete was sitting at his desk, the big CB radio crackling softly with static. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "They were talking again last night," he said without preamble. "Around 2 in the morning, same as always." "Who was?" I asked. "The other crew," he gestured at the radio. "The ones who aren't here." I must have looked confused, because he sighed and motioned for me to sit down. I pulled up a chair while he adjusted the logbook on his desk, a thick notebook where he recorded every radio transmission, time-stamped and detailed. "Started about 6 months ago," Pete said. "Maybe a little more. I was working late, doing inventory, and the radio picks up a transmission. Voice comes through, calls himself Delta 3, says he's checking in from the West Cut Block. Reports they've got 2 loads ready for pickup, requests a truck for tomorrow morning. Standard stuff." So I respond, "Ask him who his crew leader is, because we don't have anyone designated Delta 3, and we weren't working the West Block at the time." "What'd he say?" I asked. "Nothing." He didn't respond, just went silent. I figured maybe his radio died or he realized he was transmitting on the wrong channel. But then it happened again the next night. Different voice, different call sign. This one was Charlie 7, reporting from the North Block. Said they'd had a near miss with a Widowmaker, needed someone to check the rigging on their yarder. Pete opened his logbook and showed me the entries. Pages and pages of transmissions, all logged between midnight and 4 in the morning. All from call signs that didn't exist. All reporting from locations that either didn't match our current operations or were blocks we'd finished months ago. "At first I thought someone was messing with me," Pete continued. "Playing a prank, you know. But the voices, they don't sound like anyone from our crew. And they sound wrong, distant, like they're transmitting from underwater or through layers of static even when the signal's clear." I looked at the log entries. The transmissions were mundane crew check-ins, equipment requests, status updates, the kind of routine radio traffic you'd expect at any logging operation. But they were happening in the middle of the night when no one should have been working, and they were coming from crews that didn't exist. "Have you reported this?" I asked. Pete laughed, but there was no humor in it. "To who? The company? Yeah, I'll call them up and tell them my radio's picking up ghost transmissions. That'll go over real well." "Maybe it's CB Bleed," I suggested. "Another camp on the same frequency?" I checked. Nearest operation is 60 kilometers away, and they're on a different channel. And that still doesn't explain why it only happens between midnight and 4 a.m., or why the call signs are formatted the way ours are, or why— He stopped, shook his head. "Listen to me. 6 months of this, and I'm starting to sound crazy." I told him it didn't sound crazy, though I wasn't sure I meant it. Radio interference was one thing. Regular, patterned transmissions from non-existent sources was something else entirely. Over the next few weeks, Pete started looking worse. The lack of sleep was taking its toll, and he'd taken to staying in his office most nights, logging every transmission that came through. He showed me his notes, pages of transcriptions, trying to find patterns, trying to figure out who or what was broadcasting. The transmissions talked about routine work, but they also talked about accidents, equipment failures, injuries, men getting hurt or going missing in the bush. Always past tense, always reported matter-of-factly, like they were describing things that had already happened. "Delta, 3 to base. We've got a man down in Sector 12, crushed by a rolling log. Need medical evac immediately." "Charlie, 7 to base. Yarder cable snapped. 2 men injured, 1 critical. Send help." "Bravo, 6 to base. Jennings didn't come back from setting chokers. Been searching 2 hours. No sign of him." The calls for help were always urgent, always desperate, and Pete said he'd tried responding, tried offering assistance, but his transmissions never got acknowledged. It was like he was hearing one side of a conversation that happened in a different reality, unable to break through and make contact. Then, one night in early May, one of the voices said my name. Pete came to find me at breakfast the next morning. He looked even worse than usual, pale, shaking slightly, like he'd seen something that had fundamentally shaken him. "You're Richardson, right?" he asked, even though he'd known my name for 2 months. "Yeah, why?" "Come to my office, now." I followed him across the camp, sensing that something had changed. When we got to his office, he played back a recording he'd made during the night. The CB radio's voice was crackling through a portable cassette recorder. Pete had started recording the overnight transmissions, documenting everything. The voice that came through was male, middle-aged, urgent. Through the static and the distance, I could hear it clearly. Base, this is Delta 3. We need immediate shutdown of the North Block. Unstable slope, multiple hazards. Send word to Richardson. Tell Richardson to stay out of the North Block. It's not safe. Repeat. Richardson stays out of the North Block. My skin went cold. The voice repeated the message twice more, then cut off. That came through at 2:47 this morning, Pete said. I've listened to it maybe 20 times. It says your name, clear as day. Who is Delta 3? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Nobody. There is no Delta 3. There never has been. Pete looked at me hard. We're scheduled to start clearing the North Block today. You were assigned to the initial team. I stared at the radio, listening to static hiss from its speakers. Something had warned me by name to stay away from a location I was supposed to work. A voice from a crew that didn't exist, transmitted through the night when no one should have been broadcasting. I'm not going up there, I said. Pete nodded like he'd expected that. I don't blame you, but I can't justify shutting down the whole block based on a radio transmission from nobody. The company's already behind schedule. If I call this off without a real reason, I'll lose my job. Then send a different team, I said, but I'm not going to the North Block. Pete looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have stopped him. He called the crew leader and reassigned me to a different cut block on the south side of the mountain. Sent another team to the North Block instead, 3 fallers and an equipment operator running a loader. The accident happened 3 hours later. The loader rolled. The operator, a guy named Kevin Chen, was moving logs on an area that looked stable but wasn't. The ground gave way beneath the loader's right side, and the whole machine went over, pinning Kevin in the cab. It took us 40 minutes to get him out, using 2 other machines to lift the loader enough to pull him free. He was alive but barely crushed pelvis, internal injuries, 3 broken ribs. The medevac helicopter took him to Prince George, and last I heard, he spent 3 months in the hospital and never worked heavy equipment again. When I went to see Pete that evening, he was sitting at his desk with the logbook open in front of him, staring at the entry he'd made about the warning transmission. That radio's been warning people for 20 years, he said without looking up. Smart ones listen. What? I talked to the guy who ran this camp before me, called him after the accident, asked if he'd ever experienced anything strange with the radio. He told me the same thing I'm telling you. The overnight transmissions have been happening since the camp opened. Different voices, different call signs, but always the same pattern. Always between midnight and 4 a.m. Always from crews that don't exist. And the warnings? I asked. He said sometimes the voices warn people. Give them names. Tell them to stay away from specific areas. He said he learned to listen after 3 men died in a cut block the voices had warned about. Said the people who pay attention to the warnings survive. The ones who don't, Pete gestured at nothing, his face grim. Well, you saw what happened to Kevin. I transferred to a different camp the next month. Told Pete I had family reasons, needed to be closer to the coast. He didn't argue, just signed my transfer papers and shook my hand. You listened, he said. That's good, keep listening. I didn't understand what he meant until later. Because even after I left that camp near Vanderhoof, even after I moved to a different operation 100 kilometers away, I still heard the voice sometimes. Late at night, when I was trying to fall asleep, I'd hear it, not through a radio or any external source. In my head, that same distant, underwater quality, that same urgent tone. Richardson, stay out of Sector 9, it's not safe. Richardson, don't take the haul road today. Wash out at kilometer marker 12. Richardson, tell your crew to check their safety equipment. Malfunction on the loader's hydraulics. The warnings kept coming. Sometimes they were specific, sometimes vague, but they were always accurate. Every time I listened, I avoided an accident. Every time I ignored the warning and I tried, twice, to convince myself I was imagining things, something went wrong. Not always catastrophic, but wrong enough to prove the warnings were real. I don't work near Vanderhoof anymore. Haven't been back to that camp in 6 years. But I still hear the voice. Different call signs now, sometimes Delta 3, sometimes others, but always the same pattern. Always warning me, specifically me, about dangers I can't see coming. I've stopped trying to figure out who or what is broadcasting. Stop trying to rationalize it as interference or psychological projection or any of the other explanations I used to comfort myself with, because the truth is simpler and more disturbing. There's a crew out there, somewhere in the frequency spectrum between what's real and what's not. A crew that's been working the timber for longer than any of us can remember. They know the mountains, know the dangers, know which cut blocks will hold and which will give way. And for reasons I can't explain, they warn people. Not everyone, not most people, but some of us, the ones who listen survive, the ones who don't end up like Kevin Chen, broken if they're lucky, dead if they're not. Pete Whitmore still runs that camp near Vanderhoof. I called him last year just to check in, and he said the overnight transmissions are still happening. Still the same pattern, still the same mysterious crew reporting in from cut blocks that don't match reality. He said he's learned to pay attention, said he's saved 4 lives in the past 2 years by listening to the warnings and acting on them, even when he couldn't justify the decisions to the company. They know something we don't, Pete told me. Something about these mountains, about the timber, about the places where men aren't supposed to work. I don't know who they are or why they're helping us, but I'm grateful they do. I'm grateful too. Grateful and terrified in equal measure. Because sometimes, late at night, when I hear that voice warning me about tomorrow's work, I wonder if I'm hearing the past or the future. If those transmissions are coming from men who died years ago, still trying to prevent the accidents that killed them, or if they're coming from some other place entirely, some frequency where the dead still work their shifts and try to warn the living about the dangers they can't see. I don't have answers. Just the voice in my head and the knowledge that as long as I listen, I stay alive. Richardson, stay safe. The North Block isn't clear yet. I hear you. I'm listening. I always listen. Logging equipment is expensive. A new excavator runs close to $500,000. A loader can cost even more. And a feller buncher, one of those specialized machines that grabs a tree, cuts it at the base, and lays it down in one smooth operation that's pushing $700,000 or more depending on the model. So when one goes missing, it's not just a logistical problem, it's a financial disaster. Insurance gets involved, corporate management gets involved, police get involved. You don't just lose a feller buncher and shrug it off. That's why when our brand new Timber Pro went missing from the camp near Prince George in May 2018, the whole operation came to a halt. That machine had been delivered 6 months earlier, barely broken in, still had that new equipment smell when you climbed into the cab. The operator, a guy named Marcus, had parked it at the edge of the cut block, at end of shift on a Thursday, just like he did every day. Keys went to the foreman's office, as per protocol. Equipment secured, everything by the book. Friday morning, it was gone. Marcus was the first to notice. He came back from breakfast to start his shift, and found nothing but compressed ground where the feller buncher should have been. No machine, no tracks showing it had been driven away. No drag marks or signs it had been hauled by another vehicle. Just empty space and the lingering smell of hydraulic fluid. He radioed the foreman immediately, thinking maybe someone from another crew had moved it for some reason. But nobody had authorized any equipment moves. Nobody had seen anything. The keys were still in the office, hanging on their designated hook. Security hadn't logged any overnight activity. The machine had simply vanished. The foreman, a man named Bill who'd been in the industry for 30 years, called an all-hands meeting. Told us the feller buncher was missing and we were going to find it. Equipment that expensive doesn't just disappear. Someone had stolen it, or it had rolled down a slope, or there was some logical explanation we were missing. We split into search teams and spent the entire day combing the cut block and surrounding area. We found nothing. No tire tracks leading away. No damage to the fencing around the equipment yard. No signs of forced entry into the office where the keys had been stored. It was like the machine had been lifted straight up into the air and carried away. By Saturday, the RCMP were involved. They brought dogs, checked for vehicle tracks on all the logging roads in the area, interviewed the entire crew. The theory was theft. Professional equipment theft is a real problem in remote logging operations, but even the officers seemed confused by the lack of evidence. One of them told Bill he'd never seen a theft with this little to go on. No tracks, no witnesses, no security footage, nothing. The insurance company sent investigators on Monday. They went over everything: maintenance logs, operator schedules, security protocols. They took statements from everyone who'd been on site that week. They examined the ground where the feller buncher had been parked, looking for clues about how it might have been moved. After 2 days, they left looking as confused as everyone else. By the end of the first week, the prevailing theory was that it had been stolen by a sophisticated crew using a heavy-lift helicopter. That was the only explanation that made sense. Hover over the machine, attach cables, lift it out without leaving tracks. Expensive and complicated, but possible if you had the right equipment and knew what you were doing. Work resumed. The company rented a replacement feller buncher while they waited for the insurance claim to process. Marcus went back to operating, though he seemed shaken by the whole thing. Equipment was his responsibility, and losing a $700,000 machine on his watch, even if it wasn't his fault, had rattled him. 2 weeks went by. Then Marcus radioed in from a section of forest about 5 kilometers from the main camp, his voice tight with something between confusion and fear. "Bill, you need to get out here. I found it." "Found what?" Bill responded. "The feller buncher. It's here." Bill took me and 2 other guys out to Marcus's location in one of the work trucks. We drove through the active cut blocks and then beyond them, following old logging roads that hadn't been used in years. The roads got rougher as we went, overgrown with brush and small trees, barely passable. Eventually, Marcus radioed that we'd need to walk the last quarter kilometer. The road was too overgrown for the truck. We hiked in, following Marcus's directions over the radio. He'd been doing a survey of potential harvest areas when he'd stumbled onto a clearing that wasn't on any of the maps. Said he'd seen something in the trees and went to investigate. The clearing opened up ahead of us, and there it was. The feller buncher, sitting in the middle of a space surrounded by old-growth forest. Western red cedar and Douglas fir that had to be 200 years old or more, the kind of timber we weren't allowed to touch anymore. Protected old growth, far from any active logging operations. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was the condition of the machine. It was covered in moss. Thick green moss growing across the hood, the cab, the hydraulic arms. Rust had eaten through the paint in multiple places, leaving orange-brown stains bleeding down the yellow metal. The tires had rotted, collapsed under the machine's weight. The windows of the cab were filmed with grime and organic buildup. It looked like it had been sitting in that clearing for decades, but it had only been missing for 2 weeks. We stood there staring at it, none of us speaking. Bill finally walked up to the machine, running his hand along the moss-covered hood. Some of it came away in his fingers, revealing more rust underneath. "This doesn't make any sense," he said quietly. Marcus was standing back, his face pale. "That's not all. Look inside the cab." Bill climbed up onto the machine, using the step rails that were still solid enough to hold his weight. He wiped the grime off the cab window with his sleeve and looked inside. Then he went very still. "Bill?" I called. "What is it?" He didn't answer for a long moment. Then he climbed down slowly, carefully, like he was moving through water. His face had gone gray. "There's someone in there," he said, "in the operator's seat." "Someone?" I asked. "You mean like bones?" "There are bones in the cab, human bones, sitting in the operator's seat, hands still on the controls." We all looked at each other. Marcus made a sound like he might be sick. I walked up to the feller buncher and looked through the window that Bill had wiped clean. He was right. There was a skeleton in the operator's seat, still dressed in rotted work clothes, a flannel shirt, mostly disintegrated, canvas work pants, what looked like the remains of work boots. The skull was tilted slightly forward, like the operator had been looking down at the controls. The hands, just bones now, tendons long since rotted away, were positioned on the control sticks, like he'd been in the middle of operating the machine when he died. I backed away from the window, my stomach churning. Bill was already on the radio, calling the RCMP. This had gone from a stolen equipment case to something much worse. The police arrived 3 hours later, along with a forensics team from Prince George. They cordoned off the area, photographed everything, took measurements. 2 officers in protective gear opened the cab and carefully removed the remains. The skeleton was intact, still positioned in the operator's seat, still holding the controls. They found a wallet in the remains of the work pants. Inside was a driver's license, the plastic yellowed and brittle but still readable. The name on the license was Thomas Mackenzie. Date of birth, the 15th of March, 1956. One of the RCMP officers, a sergeant named Kowalski, ran the name through their database right there using his laptop. His expression changed as he read the results. "Thomas Mackenzie. he said slowly, was reported missing in September 1987. He was a logger working in this area. Disappeared during his shift, never found. Case went cold after 6 months of searching. 1,987, Bill said. That's 30 years ago. 31, Kowalski corrected. He looked at the feller buncher, then back at his laptop screen. But that doesn't make sense. This machine is brand new. You said it was delivered 6 months ago? February 2018, Bill confirmed. Fresh from the factory. That's a Timber Pro 2018 model. The company only started producing them last year. Kowalski walked around the machine again, taking in the moss, the rust, the rotted tires. So we have a man who disappeared in 1987, sitting in a machine that was manufactured in 2017, in a location that's miles from any road or active logging operation. And the machine looks like it's been here for decades. Nobody had an answer for that. The forensics team took samples of the moss, the rust, the organic material growing on the machine. They documented everything, took hundreds of photos, bagged the remains for transport to the medical examiner. The whole process took until late evening. By the time they were done, none of us wanted to be in that clearing anymore. Kowalski told us they'd be investigating checking dental records to confirm the identity of the remains, analyzing the forensic evidence, trying to understand how a machine that didn't exist in 1987 could have a man from 1,987 sitting dead in its cab. He said he'd seen strange cases before, but nothing like this. The company sent a recovery crew out 2 days later to haul the feller buncher back to camp. They brought a heavy-duty wrecker and spent most of a day getting the machine loaded and transported back over the overgrown logging roads. When they finally got it to the equipment yard, the damage was even more apparent in full daylight. The moss had grown deep into seams and gaps. The rust had compromised structural components. The hydraulic systems had seized up completely. The machine was totaled not from the 2 weeks it had been missing, but from what looked like decades of neglect and exposure. The company's insurance investigator came back, took one look at it, and immediately started making calls. The machine had been delivered 6 months ago in perfect condition. Now, it looked like a piece of archaeological evidence. The rust patterns alone suggested 20 or 30 years of weathering, not 2 weeks. The RCMP called Bill 3 weeks later with their findings. The dental records confirmed the remains were Thomas Mackenzie, the logger who'd disappeared in 1987. The forensic analysis of his clothes and the remains suggested he'd been dead for approximately 30 years, give or take. Cause of death was undetermined, no obvious trauma, no signs of violence. He'd simply died sitting in that operator's seat. But the forensics on the machine itself raised more questions than answers. The moss samples were consistent with decades of growth, not weeks. The rust patterns showed long-term oxidation. Even the rotted tires had degraded in a way that suggested years of exposure to the elements. Every piece of physical evidence said that feller buncher had been sitting in that clearing for a very long time, except it had been built less than 2 years ago. Kowalski told Bill the case was being classified as unexplained circumstances. They had no rational explanation for how a man from 1,987 ended up in a machine from 2018, or how that machine had aged 30 years in 2 weeks, or why it was sitting in a clearing miles from any road in the middle of protected old-growth forest. The company scrapped the machine, wrote it off as a total loss, collected the insurance payout, and bought a replacement. They never spoke about it publicly. Bill made it clear to all of us that we weren't to discuss what we'd found with anyone outside the crew. The official story was equipment failure and unfortunate circumstances. Nothing more. But I think about it sometimes. Think about Thomas Mackenzie, reported missing in 1987, found dead in 2018 inches, a machine that hadn't existed when he disappeared. Think about him sitting in that operator's seat, hands on the controls, like he'd been working right up until the moment he died. What had he been doing for 30 years in that clearing? Had he been operating that machine? And if so, how? The feller buncher hadn't existed in 1987, hadn't existed in 1997, hadn't existed until 2017, when the first models rolled off the factory line. Had time worked differently in that clearing? Had Thomas somehow moved forward through decades while the world around him stayed the same? Or had he been pulled into something else, some pocket of time or space, where a machine that would eventually exist could be operated by a man who had already died? I don't have answers. Neither did the RCMP. Neither did the company. All I know is what I saw: a brand new feller buncher covered in 30 years of moss and rust, with a skeleton in the operator's seat, in a clearing that wasn't supposed to exist. Marcus quit a month later, took a job with a different company down in the Fraser Valley, away from Prince George, away from those old-growth forests. He told me before he left that he couldn't get the image out of his head: Thomas Mackenzie sitting in that cab, hands on the controls, operating equipment that wouldn't be invented for another 30 years. What was he doing all that time? Marcus asked me. What was he working on, and where did all that time go? I didn't have an answer then. I still don't. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those protected old-growth forests. Think about how many clearings might be hidden in there, how many pieces of equipment might be sitting in spaces we've never logged, covered in decades of moss, with operators still at the controls, still working, still cutting timber in forests that only exist in time, that doesn't move forward the way it should. And I wonder if Thomas Mackenzie is still there, in some version of that clearing, operating a machine that doesn't exist yet, cutting trees that grow outside of normal time. I wonder if he knows he's been dead for 30 years. Or if, in that clearing, in that pocket of impossible time, he's still just doing his job, day after day, shift after shift, never realizing that the world moved on without him decades ago. Logging camps are loud. That's just the nature of the work. Chainsaws screaming through timber, skidders dragging logs across rough ground, loaders stacking wood with hydraulic arms that hiss and clank, trucks backing up with their warning beepers cutting through everything else. From sunrise to sunset, the noise is constant, overlapping, a wall of industrial sound that you eventually stop noticing. After a few weeks at a camp, you learn to hear through the noise, pick out individual sounds, identify which equipment is running where, track the progress of work by the changing pitch and rhythm of machinery. That's why we notice the whistle. It started in late June at a camp about 40 kilometers east of Terrace, a mid-sized operation working a spruce contract on Crown land. Good crew, experienced foreman, nothing out of the ordinary. We'd been there about 5 weeks when I first heard it, a high-pitched whistle cutting through the chainsaw noise, clear and distinct. 6 notes in a pattern, repeated over and over. At first I thought it was someone signaling, maybe a faller calling for help or trying to get someone's attention. But when I looked around, everyone near me was accounted for, working their sections, nobody acting like anything was wrong. The whistle kept going. Same 6 notes, same pattern, coming from the forest just beyond the edge of the cut block. Not far into the trees, maybe 50 or 60 meters, but definitely coming from the uncut timber, rather than from anyone in our work area. I mentioned it to my partner Jake during lunch break. He'd heard it too, thought maybe it was a bird, some kind of forest bird with a weird call that happened to sound like whistling. It wasn't impossible, I'd heard plenty of strange bird calls over the years. But this one was too clean, too musical. It sounded exactly like a person whistling a simple tune. The same 6 notes, over and over, with perfect consistency. By the end of the week, everyone had heard it. It would start around mid-morning, sometime between 9 and 10, and continue throughout the day. The only time it stopped was when we shut down operations for lunch or at the end of shift. As soon as the equipment went silent, the whistling would stop too. Like whoever or whatever was making the sound only performed when we were working. It drove us crazy. You'd be trying to make a cut, concentrating on your saw placement and escape route, and that whistle would cut through everything, impossible to ignore. The same 6 notes, endlessly repeated, with a rhythm that somehow made it even more annoying. It got into your head, stayed there even when you weren't hearing it. I'd wake up in my bunk at 2 in the morning with that tune running through my mind, those 6 notes playing over and over. Different guys had different theories. Some thought it was a bird, despite how unlikely that seemed. Others thought maybe it was wind through a hollow tree, or some kind of natural acoustic phenomenon created by the forest. A few thought someone was playing a prank, though nobody could figure out who or why. The foreman, a man named Ed who'd been logging for 30 years, said he'd heard of similar things before, strange sounds in the forest that defied easy explanation. He wasn't worried about it, just told us to focus on the work and ignore it. But you couldn't ignore it. That's what made it so maddening. Even when you tried to push it to the background, even when you buried yourself in the noise of your chainsaw or the rumble of equipment, that whistle would cut through, clear and sharp and impossibly consistent. 3 weeks into the whistling, a new guy joined our crew. His name was Marcus, mid-20s, fresh certification, eager to prove himself. He'd worked a few smaller operations, but this was his first major contract. Ed paired him with one of the senior fallers for training, and Marcus threw himself into the work with the kind of enthusiasm that usually either burns out quick or turns into genuine skill. On his third day, Marcus asked about the whistling. "What the hell is that sound?" he said during morning break. "It's been driving me nuts all day." We told him what we knew, which was basically nothing. It had started a few weeks ago, came from the forest beyond the cut block, happened only during work hours, and nobody had been able to explain it. "Has anyone gone to look?" Marcus asked. "Where?" Jake replied. "It's coming from the forest. You want to go hiking through uncut timber looking for the source of a weird whistle?" "Why not?" Marcus shrugged. "It's probably just a bird or something, but if it's not, wouldn't you want to know?" The foreman said to ignore it. I told him, "Focus on the work." That's good advice. But I could see Marcus wasn't satisfied with that answer. He kept looking toward the tree line, listening to that whistle, his expression thoughtful. The kid had that combination of curiosity and confidence that can either serve you well in the bush or get you killed. I couldn't tell which way he'd go yet. 2 days later, the whistling started up around 9:30, like it always did. I was bucking logs about 30 meters from the edge of the cut block when I saw Marcus walking toward the trees. He'd put down his chainsaw and was moving with purpose, his head cocked to the side like he was tracking the sound. "Marcus," I called out, "where are you going?" He turned and gave me a thumbs up. "Just gonna check it out, be right back." Ed said to stay in the work area, but Marcus was already at the tree line, stepping into the shadows between the standing timber. I watched him disappear into the forest, swallowed by the dense undergrowth and the darkness under the canopy. The whistling stopped immediately. I stood there with my saw idling, staring at the spot where Marcus had entered the forest. The sudden silence was jarring. We'd gotten so used to that constant 6-note pattern that its absence felt wrong, like a sound you expect to hear had been suddenly cut off. I waited, expecting Marcus to come back out any second. Maybe he'd found nothing, and the whistle had stopped because he'd disturbed whatever was making it. Or maybe he'd found the source and was dealing with it. Either way, he should have been back within a few minutes. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The whistle didn't start again. Marcus didn't emerge from the forest. I told Jake what had happened, and we both walked to the tree line, calling Marcus's name. No response. We radioed Ed, explained the situation. He shut down operations and organized a search party. 8 of us, spread out in a line, walking into the forest in the direction Marcus had gone. We searched for the rest of that day, calling his name, marking our path so we could find our way back. The forest was dense, old second growth with thick underbrush, fallen logs covered in moss, terrain that made walking difficult and visibility limited. No sign of Marcus, no disturbed ground, no broken branches, no indication that anyone had passed through recently. We searched all the next day too, expanding our pattern, covering more ground. The RCMP sent officers to help, brought dogs. The dogs picked up Marcus's scent at the edge of the cut block, but lost it about 50 meters into the forest, like he'd just vanished. On the third day, one of the fallers, a guy named Tom, found him. Marcus was sitting against the base of a large cedar tree, maybe a kilometer from where he'd entered the forest. He was alive, breathing normally, but completely unresponsive. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead at nothing. He didn't react when Tom called his name, didn't move when Tom touched his shoulder, just sat there, perfectly still, like a statue. We carried him back to camp and radioed for medical evacuation. The paramedics arrived by helicopter within an hour, examined him, and said his vital signs were normal, but he was in some kind of dissociative state. They loaded him onto the helicopter and took him to the hospital in Terrace. Ed told us Marcus would be fine, that sometimes people go into shock in the bush and it takes time to come out of it. But I could see he was worried. We all were. Marcus had only been gone 3 days, but he looked like he'd been out there for weeks. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and his eyes had a hollow quality that hadn't been there before. I visited him in the hospital 4 days later. They'd moved him out of emergency into a regular room, said he was physically healthy but still not talking much. When I walked in, Marcus was sitting up in bed, staring at the wall. He looked over when I entered, and I saw recognition in his eyes. Relief, almost. "Hey," I said, pulling up a chair, "how you feeling?" Marcus didn't answer right away, just kept looking at me like he was trying to figure out what to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, scratchy from disuse. "I found it," he said. "The Whistler. I found him." I leaned forward. "What was it? What did you find?" "A man," Marcus said quietly, "standing in the trees, maybe 100 meters in, tall and thin, wearing old logger's gear, canvas pants, suspenders, cork boots, the kind of clothes you see in photos from the 50s or 60s. He was just standing there whistling, those same 6 notes, over and over." "Did you talk to him?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I asked him why he was whistling, asked him if he knew we could hear him from the cut block. He stopped whistling and looked at me, really looked at me, and he smiled." The way Marcus said smiled made my skin crawl. Not like he was describing something friendly or reassuring, like he was describing something that wore the shape of a smile, but meant something else entirely. "What did he say?" I asked. "He said, 'I'm not whistling for you, I'm calling them back.'" Marcus's eyes were wide now, his hands gripping the bedsheet. I asked him what he meant. Who was he calling back? And he just kept smiling and said, "The ones who haven't left yet, the ones who are still trying to find their way home." "I don't understand," I said. "Who?" "He said the forest takes men sometimes," Marcus interrupted. "Loggers who go in and never come out. Most people think they got lost, or injured, or killed by animals. But some of them are still in there, still walking through the trees, trying to find their way back. And he whistles for them, calls them home." I sat back in my chair, processing this. "Marcus, that doesn't make any sense. You were only gone for 3 days. We searched." "It felt like weeks," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "I don't remember most of it. Just walking through the forest, following his whistle. He'd move deeper into the trees, and I'd follow. Every time I thought I was catching up, he'd be farther away. The whistle would echo through the forest, and I'd follow it. I don't remember sleeping or eating or stopping, just walking, trying to reach him." "How did we find you?" "I don't know. I just remember sitting down against that tree, and then Tom was there, pulling me up, like I'd blinked and lost everything in between." Marcus was released from the hospital 2 days later, but he quit logging immediately. Didn't even come back to collect his gear from the camp. Just told Ed over the phone that he was done, that he was moving back to Alberta where his family lived. Ed tried to talk him into finishing the contract, but Marcus wouldn't budge. He was gone within a week. The whistling never stopped. It's still there, in that forest beyond the cut block, starting around mid-morning, stopping when we shut down for the day. The same 6 notes, over and over, echoing through the trees. Ed brought in a specialist, some kind of wildlife biologist who studies animal sounds. She spent 2 days recording the whistle, analyzing it with equipment I didn't understand. When she left, she told Ed it wasn't any bird she knew of, and the pattern was too complex to be wind or some natural acoustic phenomenon. She said it sounded like someone whistling, but she had no explanation for who or why. The crew learned to live with it. You had to. The work needed to get done, and you couldn't let a strange sound stop operations. But it wore on people. Guys would get irritable, distracted, unable to focus. A few quit without explanation, just packed up and left. Ed had to bring in replacement workers more often than usual, and the new guys would always ask about the whistle within their first few days. I stayed until the contract ended in September. By then, I'd heard that whistle for 3 solid months. Those same 6 notes burned into my memory so deep I heard them in my sleep. I've taken jobs at other camps since then, all over British Columbia, but I've never gone back to that site near Terrace. But I think about Marcus's story sometimes, about the man in old logger's gear, standing in the forest, whistling those 6 notes, calling them back, the ones who haven't left yet, the ones still trying to find their way home. I think about all the men who've gone missing in the BC forests over the decades, loggers who walked into the trees and never came out. How many of them are still in there, somewhere, following that whistle, trying to find their way back to a camp that was shut down years ago, to a life they don't remember leaving? And I think about what Marcus said, that it felt like weeks, even though he'd only been gone 3 days. Like time worked differently in that forest. Like the deeper you went following that whistle, the more disconnected you became from the normal world. The whistler is still there, still calling. And somewhere in those trees, men are still following, still trying to find their way home, walking through a forest that won't let them leave. I hope they find their way eventually. I hope that whistle leads them somewhere, even if it's not back to us. But I don't think it does. I think they just keep walking, following those 6 notes deeper and deeper into a forest that has no end, answering a call that will never let them rest. And every time I hear a whistle in the woods, even just a bird call or someone signaling, those same 6 notes come back to me. And I remember Marcus's face in that hospital room, hollow and haunted, telling me about the man who smiled and said he was calling them back. I remember. And I don't go into the trees alone anymore. In 2015, a logging camp went up near Chetwynd, about 40 kilometers into the bush off the Alaska Highway. I was part of the crew that built it, 30 of us working through late summer and early fall, clearing land, pouring foundations, raising the bunkhouses and mess hall, and equipment sheds. It was supposed to be a 5-year operation, big enough for 100 men working shifts around the clock during peak season. The company did everything by the book. Geotechnical surveys before we broke ground, soil samples sent to labs in Vancouver, engineers signing off on every stage of construction. The reports came back clean, solid bedrock 12 feet down, stable soil composition, no water table issues, no seismic concerns. Perfect site for a permanent camp, better than most locations I'd worked. We finished construction in October. The camp opened for operations the first week of November. I stayed on as part of the maintenance crew. My job was keeping the generators running, fixing equipment, making sure the physical infrastructure held up through the winter. Easy work, good pay, comfortable bunkhouse with heat and hot water. I'd worked worse camps in worse conditions. The camp ran smooth for 8 months. November through February, we cut timber in conditions that would have shut down smaller operations. Temperatures hitting -30, snow accumulation measured in meters, equipment freezing if you left it idle too long. But the camp held up. Buildings stayed warm. Generators ran clean. Roads stayed passable with regular plowing. By March, we were ahead of schedule, cutting more timber than projected. No major incidents, no serious injuries. Then, on a Tuesday morning in mid-March, I woke up and my bunk was tilted. Not much, maybe 3 or 4 degrees, but enough that I noticed it immediately when I opened my eyes. The water in the glass on my bedside table was sitting at an angle. My boots had slid from where I'd left them the night before, piled up against the far wall. I got dressed and went outside. The sun was just coming up, pale light filtering through the trees. The first thing I noticed was the mess hall. The whole building was listing to one side, the east wall sitting maybe a foot lower than the west wall, not collapsed, not damaged, just tilted, like someone had picked up one corner and set it down wrong. I walked over to it. The door was jammed partway open, the frame tweaked out of alignment. I could hear voices inside the cook and a few early risers trying to figure out what had happened. I dinged through the gap and found the interior worse than the exterior. Everything loose had rolled or slid to the low side. Tables pushed together, chairs piled up. The kitchen equipment tilted at angles that made my brain hurt to look at. Foundations settled. The cook said when he saw me. He was an older guy, maybe 60, had worked camps for 40 years. Seen it before, happens sometimes with new construction. Frost heave pushes things around, ground settles when it thaws. But frost heave didn't explain what I was seeing. The whole building had dropped, not just settled, dropped, and it was still dropping. I could feel it, a subtle sensation, like standing on an elevator that was descending very slowly. My inner ear registering movement that my eyes couldn't quite confirm. I went back outside and checked the other buildings. Bunkhouse A was tilted. Bunkhouse B had sunk 6 inches on the north end. The equipment shed was sitting at an angle that put stress on the walls. Even the gravel roads looked wrong, sunken in places, humped in others, like the ground beneath them was shifting. The foreman called an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. By then, everyone had noticed. Hard not to when your bunkhouse was tilting under you, and the paths between buildings had developed slopes that hadn't been there yesterday. Nobody panic, the foreman said. His name was Gerald, and he'd been running camps for the company for 15 years. Steady guy, not prone to exaggeration, but I could see the worry in his face. We're shutting down operations until we figure out what's happening. Engineers are flying in this afternoon. In the meantime, everybody stays in camp. No work, no equipment operation, just sit tight. We sat tight, watched the camp sink, because that's what it was doing. Sinking, not collapsing, not falling apart, descending into the ground in a slow, steady subsidence that you could measure by the hour. By noon, the mess hall had dropped another 8 inches. The bunkhouses were tilting more severely. The equipment shed's door wouldn't close because the frame had warped. The engineers arrived at 3 p.m. via helicopter. 2 of them, both looking grim as they climbed out with their equipment cases. They spent 2 hours taking measurements, drilling soil samples, checking the foundations. I watched them work, watched their expressions get tighter as they compared notes and ran calculations. Gerald called another meeting at 6 p.m. The engineers stood beside him, and their body language told me everything before they opened their mouths. "We're evacuating," Gerald said. "Immediate evacuation. Pack your essentials. Helicopters are coming to ferry people out in 2-hour shifts. First group leaves in 20 minutes. "What's happening?" someone asked. One of the engineers, the younger one, maybe 35, wearing glasses and a company jacket, cleared his throat. "The ground beneath the camp is experiencing subsidence. The rate is accelerating. We don't know why. The bedrock we surveyed is still there, 12 feet down, solid as it ever was. But the soil above it is," he hesitated. "It's moving, compacting, disappearing into voids we can't locate or explain." "Is it a sinkhole?" someone else asked. "No. Sinkholes have identifiable causes: limestone dissolution, underground cavities, water erosion. This is none of those things. The geology here doesn't support sinkhole formation. What we're seeing is," he looked at his partner, the older engineer, who just shook his head slightly. "We don't have an explanation. We evacuated in shifts. I was in the 3rd group, leaving around midnight. By then, the camp was almost unrecognizable. The mess hall had sunk until only the roof peak was visible above ground level. Bunkhouse A was tilted at 45 degrees. Bunkhouse B had dropped so far that the windows were below grade, buried in earth that had somehow risen around them. The equipment shed had collapsed entirely, its roof flat against the ground. The helicopter lifted off, and I looked down at the camp. In the darkness, with just the emergency lights still burning, it looked like a model someone had pushed halfway into sand. Buildings at wrong angles, roads disappearing into depressions, everything slowly descending into earth that shouldn't have been swallowing it. The company cordoned off the site, put up fencing and warning signs. Engineers came back twice more over the following week, trying to study what was happening, trying to find an explanation. The reports they filed were technical and full of jargon I didn't understand, but the conclusion was simple: impossible. What was happening to that camp was geologically impossible. I couldn't let it go. The place had been my home for 8 months. I'd helped build it, watched it run smooth and profitable for months, and now it was sinking into the ground for no reason anyone could explain. A week after the evacuation, I drove back out to the site. The company had told us to stay away, but I wasn't on the payroll anymore. They'd terminated everyone's contracts the day after the evacuation, so I figured they couldn't stop me from looking. The fence was easy enough to get past. Just climbed over at a spot where the posts had already started tilting, walked down the old access road toward where the camp should have been. The camp was half gone. The mess hall had sunk completely. I could see the peak of the roof maybe 2 feet above ground level, the metal ridge cap glinting in the afternoon sun. Everything else was underground. The bunkhouses were worse, just the top corners of the roofs visible, like someone had buried buildings and left the tips showing. The equipment shed was completely gone, nothing but flat ground where it had stood. And in the center of it all, where the main generator building had been, there was a hole, perfectly circular, maybe 30 feet across, descending straight down into darkness that my eyes couldn't penetrate even in full daylight. I walked toward it carefully. The ground felt solid under my boots, but I didn't trust it. Not after watching buildings sink into earth that should have been stable. I stopped about 10 feet from the edge and looked down. The hole was deep, very deep. I couldn't see the bottom, even with the sun almost directly overhead, just darkness swallowing light. The walls were smooth, not natural rock, not soil, just smooth, almost polished, like something had drilled or melted or carved a perfect cylinder into the earth. I heard water, a distant sound of flowing water echoing up from the depths. Made sense. We were probably hitting an aquifer or underground stream, probably what had caused the subsidence, water eroding something beneath the bedrock. Then I heard the other sounds. Machinery, the rumble of generators running, the whine of electric motors, the distant clang of metal on metal. I stepped closer to the edge. The sounds were coming from deep in the hole, far below where the water sounds originated. They echoed strangely, distorted by distance and the acoustics of the shaft, but I recognized them. I'd lived with those sounds for 8 months. Generator hum, equipment operation, the camp running. The camp was still running, down there in the dark, somehow still operational, even though it had sunk hundreds of feet into the earth and should have been crushed or flooded or destroyed. I stood there listening to impossible sounds echoing from impossible depths and felt my hands start shaking. This wasn't geological. This wasn't explained by water erosion or soil compaction or any natural process. Something had pulled that camp down into the earth, was still pulling it, and somehow, impossibly, the camp was still functioning in whatever darkness it had descended into. I backed away from the hole, walked quickly back to my truck, drove straight to the company office in Fort Street, John, and filed a report. Told them about the hole, about the sounds, about the camp still running underground. They listened, took notes, said they'd send another team to investigate. The team went out 3 days later. I wasn't invited, but I got the report secondhand from Gerald, who still had contacts in the company. The team arrived at the site, walked to where the camp had been, and found nothing. No hole, no sunk buildings, no evidence that anything had ever been there. The ground was smooth and undisturbed, covered in the same pine needle duff and scattered undergrowth as the surrounding forest, like the camp had never existed. The team drilled test holes, dug excavations, ran ground-penetrating radar, found nothing, no voids, no buried structures, no anomalies. Just solid earth and bedrock 12 feet down, exactly as the original surveys had shown. The company shut down the investigation, wrote the whole thing off as a catastrophic foundation failure due to undetected geological instability, paid out insurance claims, moved operations to a different site 50 kilometers north, never spoke about it publicly. But I spoke to the other guys from that camp, the 30 of us who'd been there when it sank, and every single one of them remembered it the same way I did. Remembered the buildings tilting, the ground swallowing everything, the evacuation in the middle of the night. We compared notes, dates, details, everything matched. We hadn't imagined it, hadn't collectively hallucinated 8 months of work and then a sinking camp. It had happened. We'd all seen it. Some of the guys tried to go back, tried to find the site, to verify it was really gone, but none of them could. The access road was still there, marked on maps, but when you followed it to where the camp should have been, you just found forest. Like the camp had been erased not just physically but geographically, removed from the landscape entirely. I tried once more myself, 2 years later. Drove out with a GPS unit loaded with the exact coordinates from the construction survey. Found the location easily enough. Stood right where the mess hall should have been, where I'd eaten breakfast every morning for 8 months. Nothing, just trees and undergrowth and the soft carpet of needles under my boots. But I heard it, faint, very faint. The rumble of generators running, the whine of equipment, the distant sounds of a camp operating somewhere beneath my feet. I knelt down, put my hand flat against the ground, felt a vibration, subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but definitely there. A rhythmic pulse that matched the frequency of industrial generators. The camp was still there, still running, buried so deep that radar couldn't find it and excavations couldn't reach it, but still operational, still cutting timber in the darkness below the earth. I stood up and walked back to my truck. Haven't been back since, but I think about it. Think about those buildings descending into that perfectly circular hole. Think about how the ground closed over them, swallowing evidence of their existence. Think about the machinery sounds echoing up from depths that shouldn't have machinery. And I think about the crew, the 100 men who'd been scheduled to work that camp for 5 years. We evacuated before anyone got hurt. But what if we hadn't? What if the sinking had happened at night when everyone was asleep? Would we have gone down with the buildings? Would we have woken up buried alive, generators still running, equipment still operational, trying to cut timber in absolute darkness? I've worked a dozen other camps since then, different companies, different regions, and at every single one, I checked the geological surveys twice, read every engineer's report, ask about the ground stability, because I know now that sometimes the earth opens up and swallows things, and sometimes what it swallows keeps running, keeps operating, keeps existing in spaces that aren't supposed to exist. Gerald told me something 6 months after the evacuation. We ran into each other at a bar in Fort St. John, both of us working different jobs by then. He'd had a few drinks and was feeling talkative. The company got a recording, he said, from the site. After the investigation team found nothing. Motion-activated trail camera, someone had set up to monitor wildlife. It was mounted on a tree maybe 100 yards from where the camp had been. What did it show? I asked. Nothing, just forest. But the audio, he took another drink. The audio picked up sounds, generator hum, equipment operation, voices shouting directions. All the sounds of a working camp, recorded over 3 days after the investigation team said there was nothing there. Where's the recording now? Company destroyed it, said it was corrupted data, audio artifacts from electromagnetic interference. He looked at me, but I heard it before they wiped it. That was our camp. Those were our generators, still running, still working. I still have the steel-toed boots I wore when I worked that camp. They sit in my garage, haven't touched them in years. But sometimes late at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I swear I can feel that vibration through them. That subtle pulse of generators running somewhere beneath the earth. The camp that sank still operating in the dark. Still cutting timber that will never see daylight. Still running shifts for a crew that evacuated 7 years ago. And I wonder if it'll ever stop. If those generators will run forever in whatever space the earth created when it swallowed that camp. Or if someday the ground will open again and spit everything back out, buildings and equipment and 8 months of life preserved perfectly in darkness, waiting for a crew that will never return. I don't know. Nobody knows. The company doesn't talk about it. The engineers can't explain it. And those of us who were there just try not to think about it. But we hear it. All of us. The guys from that crew. Late at night when everything else is quiet. The sound of generators rumbling, equipment running, a camp that shouldn't exist, operating in darkness that shouldn't contain it. Still working, still cutting, still there. Somewhere beneath our feet. Every logging camp has a long timer. Someone who's been there so long, they're part of the infrastructure. They know every trail, every piece of equipment, every story about the place and the people who've worked it. They're the ones you go to when you need to find something, fix something, or understand how things really work versus how management says they work. At our camp near Smithers, that was Henry Volkman. Henry had been logging the mountains around Smithers for 30 years. Started in 1989 when he was 25, fresh off a failed attempt at university and looking for work that paid well and didn't require sitting in an office. He found it in the bush. Turned out he was good at it, patient, methodical, never rushed a cut, never took stupid risks. The kind of logger who made it to retirement with all his fingers and no major injuries. By the time I started at the camp in 2017, Henry was 53 and had been working the same operation for longer than most of us had been alive. He lived in Bunkhouse A, same room he'd occupied since 1989. Worked the same shifts, ate breakfast at the same table in the mess hall, had the same routines he'd developed over 3 decades. He knew every cut block within 50 kilometers, knew which roads washed out in spring, and which equipment had quirks that only showed up after extended use. If you needed to know something about the camp or the work, you asked Henry. He wasn't particularly friendly, didn't go out of his way to socialize or make small talk, but he wasn't unfriendly either, just quiet, self-contained. The kind of guy who did his work, ate his meals, and kept to himself unless you specifically needed his help. Then he'd give you exactly the information you needed in exactly as many words as necessary and go back to whatever he'd been doing. I liked him. Most people did. He was reliable in a way that's rare. You knew where you stood with Henry, knew he'd show up on time, do his job properly, and not cause drama or complications. In a camp full of personalities and conflicts, and the usual interpersonal chaos of 100 men living in close quarters, Henry was a constant, steady, unchanging. He retired in August 2019. The company threw him a party in the mess hall, gave him a plaque with 30 years of service engraved on it, a generous pension package, and a round of applause from everyone who'd worked with him. Henry stood up front, looking uncomfortable with the attention, said a few words about how he'd enjoyed the work in the mountains, and was looking forward to spending time with his daughter in Victoria. Then he packed his belongings from Bunkhouse A, loaded them into his truck, and drove away. We all said goodbye, shook his hand, told him to enjoy retirement. The usual things you say when someone leaves a place they've been part of for 3 decades. 3 days later, Henry was back. I saw him first. I was in the mess hall getting breakfast around 6:30 a.m., the usual time, half awake and not really paying attention to who else was there. I grabbed coffee, filled a plate with eggs and toast, and turned around to find a table. Henry was sitting in his usual spot, same table he'd sat at every morning for 30 years, in the corner near the windows, wearing his usual flannel shirt and work pants, eating breakfast like he'd never left. I stood there with my tray, staring. He looked up, saw me, nodded once in acknowledgement, and went back to his eggs. I sat down at a different table with a couple other guys from my crew. "Is that Henry?" I asked quietly. They looked over. One of them, a equipment operator named Mike, frowned. "Yeah, guess he came back. Didn't he retire? Move to Victoria?" That's what I thought. We finished breakfast. Henry finished his. He stood up, took his tray to the washing station, and walked out of the mess hall, heading toward the equipment yard like he was going to work. Same routine he'd followed every day for 30 years. I caught up with him outside. "Henry, hey, what are you doing back?" He stopped, turned, looked at me with mild confusion. "Back from where?" "From Victoria. You retired. You moved to be with your daughter." The confusion on his face deepened. "What are you talking about? I didn't go anywhere. Been here same as always. We had a party for you. 3 days ago. You said goodbye." Henry shook his head slowly. "You feeling okay? I've been here the whole time, working same as I have been for 30 years. He walked away before I could respond, headed to the equipment yard where the morning crew was gathering for assignments. I stood there watching him go, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Mike came up beside me. "That was weird," Mike said. "Yeah. You think he changed his mind? Came back because retirement didn't suit him?" "Maybe. But why would he say he never left?" Mike shrugged. "Guy's 53. Maybe he's having some kind of, I don't know, memory thing, confusion." But Henry didn't seem confused. He seemed certain, absolutely certain that he'd never left the camp, never retired, never moved to Victoria. The foreman, a man named Ray who'd worked with Henry for 15 years, pulled him aside that morning. I wasn't there for the conversation, but Ray told me about it later. He'd asked Henry the same things I had. Why was he back? What about retirement? What about Victoria and his daughter? Henry had given the same answers. Said he'd never left. Said he'd been at the camp the whole time. Ray had pressed him, reminded him of the retirement party, the plaque, the goodbye speeches. Henry had looked at Ray like he was speaking a foreign language. No memory of any of it. As far as Henry was concerned, August 2019 had proceeded like any other month. Work, breakfast, sleep, repeat. No retirement, no leaving. Ray called Henry's daughter. Her name was Sarah, lived in Victoria, had been the primary reason Henry retired in the first place. Wanted to spend time with her and his 2 grandkids while he was still healthy enough to enjoy it. Sarah answered on the second ring. Ray put her on speaker so I could hear. We were in his office, door closed. "Sarah, this is Ray Peterson from the Smithers operation. I'm calling about your father." Silence on the line. Then carefully, "My father? Henry. He's here at the camp. Showed up this morning. Says he never left. We're trying to figure out what's going on." Another long silence. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was tight. "Ray, my father died 2 years ago." Ray and I looked at each other. "What?" Ray said. "He died in March 2017. Heart attack. We buried him in Victoria. I sent flowers to the camp. You sent condolences on behalf of the company." "Sarah, I'm looking at him right now. He's here. He's working." "That's not possible. I know what I'm seeing." "Then you're not seeing my father." Her voice cracked slightly. "Ray, I buried him. I was at the funeral. I visited his grave. He's been dead for 2 years. Ray asked her to send photos. Proof. She said she would, and hung up. The photos arrived by email 20 minutes later. Funeral program, obituary, pictures of a gravestone with Henry Volkmann's name, 1964 to 2017, engraved in granite. Photos of Sarah and 2 children standing by the grave, flowers laid at the base. Ray and I looked at the photos, looked at each other, didn't say anything for a long time. "That's impossible," Ray finally said. "He's here, I just talked to him." "I know. So either Sarah's lying or..." He stopped. Didn't finish the sentence because there was no way to finish it that made sense. We went to find Henry. He was in the equipment yard, checking over a skidder that needed maintenance. We approached him together, Ray holding his phone with the photos pulled up. "Henry, we need to talk." Henry looked up from the skidder. "About what?" Ray held up the phone, showed him the photos. The funeral, the grave, the obituary. "About this." Henry looked at the screen. His expression didn't change. No shock, no recognition, nothing. He just looked at the photos like they were pictures of a stranger. "That's not me," he said. "It has your name on it. Your daughter sent it." "I don't have a daughter." Ray lowered the phone. "Henry, yes you do. Sarah, lives in Victoria, 2 grandkids. You retired to spend time with them." Henry shook his head. "Never married, no kids, been logging here for 30 years. Same as always." He went back to the skidder, started checking the hydraulic lines like the conversation had never happened. Ray and I walked away. We didn't know what else to do. That was 2 years ago. Henry is still here. Every morning he shows up for breakfast at 6:30, sits at his usual table, eats eggs and toast and drinks coffee. Then he goes out to work, checks equipment, runs maintenance, occasionally takes a shift operating machinery when we're short-handed. Every evening, he comes back to the mess hall for dinner. Every night, he goes back to Bunkhouse A and sleeps in his usual room. He never ages, doesn't get older or younger, just stays 53, same as he was when he retired, or when he died, or whatever actually happened to him. We've tried everything. Tried to make him remember the retirement party. Showed him the plaque, it's still hanging in the foreman's office. He looks at it like it belongs to someone else. Tried to make him call Sarah. He says he doesn't know anyone by that name. Tried to get him to leave the camp, take a day off, drive into Smithers. He refuses, says he has work to do. The company doesn't know. We haven't told them. How would we explain it? That a man who retired 2 years ago, who, according to his daughter, died 2 years before that, is still showing up for work every day? They'd shut down the camp for psychiatric evaluation. Or worse. So we just live with it. Work alongside him. Say good morning when we see him at breakfast. Ask his advice when we need help with equipment or routes. He gives the same reliable answers he always gave. Does the same quality work. Never causes problems. Some of the guys think he's a ghost. That he died in 2017 like Sarah said, and what we're seeing is some kind of residual haunting. The ghost of Henry still working the camp because that's all he knew how to do for 30 years. But he's solid. Eats real food. Uses real equipment. Leaves footprints in mud and snow. You can touch him if you need to get his attention. He feels real, solid, warm. Other guys think he's from before. That somehow we're seeing Henry from an earlier time, maybe from the 90s or early 2000s, when he was still in his prime and hadn't thought about retirement yet. That there's some kind of temporal loop or overlap, and the Henry from 30 years ago is bleeding through into our present. But he doesn't look younger. Looks exactly like he did in 2019 when he retired. Same age, same clothes, same mannerisms. I don't know what he is. None of us do. All I know is that Henry Volkman never left. Or he left and came back. Or he died and came back. Or he's still here because some part of him never understood that he was supposed to leave. I talked to him about it once. It was late evening, after dinner. Most guys had gone to their bunkhouses or were playing cards in the common room. Henry was sitting alone at his usual table, drinking coffee and looking out the window at the forest. I sat down across from him. "Henry, can I ask you something?" He looked at me, nodded. "Do you remember anything before the camp, before you started logging?" He thought about it, took a long time to answer. "No," he finally said. "Just this, the camp, the work, the mountains." "What about your family, your life before this?" "There wasn't anything before this." "Everyone has something before. Childhood, school, parents." He shook his head. "Not me, just this, always been here." "Don't you ever want to leave? See something else?" He looked back out the window. "Where would I go? This is where I belong." I didn't push it. Didn't see the point. Henry believed he'd always been here, would always be here. And maybe he was right. Maybe for him, there was no before and no after. Just an eternal present where he worked the same camp, ate the same meals, followed the same routines he'd followed for 30 years. The new guys don't know. We don't tell them. They just think Henry is a long-timer who's been here forever, which in a way is true. When they ask how long he's been working the camp, we say 30 years. When they ask if he ever takes time off, we say no. All of it accurate. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if we forced him to confront it, drove him to Victoria, took him to his own grave, made him see the proof. But I think I know what would happen. He'd look at the gravestone the same way he looked at the photos, like it belonged to someone else, like it had nothing to do with him. And then he'd ask to come back to camp because he had work to do. Ray retired last year. New foreman came in, younger guy who didn't know Henry from before. I pulled him aside on his second day and told him about Henry, about the retirement that might not have happened and the death that definitely did, about how Henry had been here for 30 years and might be here for 30 more. The new foreman listened, looked at me like I was insane. Then he saw Henry at breakfast the next morning, watched him go through his routine, and came back to me looking pale. "That's really him?" he asked. "The guy who died in 2017? According to his daughter, yeah. What are we supposed to do? Nothing. Just let him work. He's good at what he does." And that's what we do. We let Henry work. Let him exist in whatever state of being he's in. Let him have breakfast and dinner and sleep in Bunkhouse A and log the same mountains he's logged for 3 decades. Because what else can we do? We can't make him leave if he doesn't know he's supposed to. Can't make him remember what he's forgotten. Can't make him die if he's already dead. So Henry stays. And every morning, I see him at breakfast, sitting at his usual table, drinking his coffee and looking out at the mountains. And every morning, I wonder if today will be the day he remembers. The day he realizes he retired, or died, or somehow got stuck in a loop that won't let him go. But he never does. He just eats his eggs and toast, finishes his coffee, and heads out to work. Same as he has for 30 years. Same as he'll probably do for 30 more. And none of us have the heart to tell him he's been dead for 2 years. Because maybe he isn't. Maybe death works differently for people like Henry, who spent so much of their lives in one place doing one thing that they couldn't leave even when they were supposed to. Or maybe we're all dead, and Henry's the only one who knows it. The only one who's accepted that this camp, these mountains, this work, it's not a job anymore. It's eternity. And some of us have been here a lot longer than we think. I try not to consider that possibility. Try to tell myself that I'm real, that my life before the camp was real, that someday I'll leave and do something else. But I've been here 5 years now. And sometimes, when I sit at breakfast and see Henry in his usual spot, I wonder if 30 years from now I'll be the one sitting there, unable to remember anything before the camp, unable to imagine anything after. Still working, still eating the same meals, still following the same routines. Never leaving, just like Henry.